There is a town in America that does not appear on any map. Its zip code has never been confirmed. Its state changes depending on which episode you happen to be watching. It has mountains visible from a coastline, a desert within driving distance of a Canadian border, and weather patterns that seem to operate on their own private logic, independent of geography or season. The people who live there have yellow skin. Most of them have 4 fingers on each hand. The children have been the same age for 36 years. And somehow, again and again, the writers who created that town have looked out at the real world and described something that hadn't happened yet. Welcome to Springfield. Tonight, we're going to spend a long, slow, comfortable time in that town. We're going to pull up a chair, settle in, and go through the predictions one by one. Not rushing, not breathless, just steady, quiet, patient storytelling. Because these stories deserve that kind of attention. They're too strange, and in some cases too unsettling, to be rushed through. Every one of them has layers underneath it. Every one of them has context that makes it stranger, or sadder, or more interesting than the headline version you might have seen shared on social media. So, let's begin at the beginning. Not with Trump, not with the pandemic episode, not with the tiger attack. Let's begin with the thing that makes all of it possible. The show itself. The Simpsons first aired on the 17th of December 1989. It was a Sunday night. The episode was called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, a Christmas special in which Homer discovers that his holiday bonus has been canceled and takes a second job as a department store Santa Claus, only to end up at a dog track on Christmas Eve, trying to win enough money to buy presents for his family. He picks a greyhound named Santa's Little Helper. The dog loses. Its owner abandons it at the track. And Homer, broke, giftless, and standing in a cold parking lot, sees his son's disappointed face and does the only thing he can think of. He brings the dog home. That is how the longest-running scripted primetime television program in American history began. A man who failed at every practical option available to him chose love over logic, and his family got a pet out of it. There was nothing prophetic about that first episode. It was warm and domestic and funny in a way that felt familiar, slightly exaggerated from reality but recognizably grounded in it. Homer was a working-class father who made mistakes. Marge was a patient, devoted mother who held the family together through a kind of quiet determination that never quite got the recognition it deserved. Bart was 10 years old and already constitutionally incapable of following rules. Lisa was 8, brilliant, sensitive, already a little lonely. And Maggie was 1, silent, observant, communicating entirely through the rhythm of her pacifier. You could watch that first episode and feel like you understood exactly what kind of show this was going to be. You would have been wrong. Not immediately wrong. For the first few seasons, The Simpsons was largely what it appeared to be, a satire of American family life, sharply observed, consistently funny, willing to go to emotional places that animated television had never explored before. It dealt with real things, job loss, marital strain, the pressure of trying to give your children a better life than you had, while quietly knowing that you might not be the person capable of doing that. Homer's anxiety about being a good father was genuinely felt. Marge's loneliness in a marriage to a man who didn't always see her was genuinely felt. The comedy was smart without being cold. The sentiment was real without being maudlin. It was, by most reasonable assessments, one of the finest television programs ever made. And then it kept going, season after season, decade after decade. The show that was supposed to burn bright and fade, the way smart comedies often do, just kept running. Other animated shows came and went. Sitcoms rose and fell. The landscape of television transformed around it completely, from network dominance to cable fragmentation to streaming upheaval. The Simpsons watched all of it happen from the same couch, in the same living room, on the same street in the same impossible town. By the time the show reached its 10th season, it had already produced more hours of comedy than most shows produce in their entire runs. By its 20th, it had become something different from a television program. It had become a cultural institution, a shared language, the kind of thing that people who had never watched a single episode still knew about, still quoted, still referenced without quite realizing where the reference came from. And somewhere along the way, people started to notice something strange. The show kept being right about things. Not vaguely right. Not sort of adjacent to something that happened right. specifically, eerily, uncomfortably right about things that had not yet occurred when the episodes were written and produced. Technologies that didn't exist, political events that hadn't happened, corporate deals that hadn't been made, scientific discoveries that hadn't been confirmed, cultural moments that were still years away. A smartwatch appeared in a 1995 episode. The Disney-Fox merger was depicted in 1998, more than 20 years before it happened. A Trump presidency was treated as an obvious satirical endpoint to celebrity culture in 2016 years before it became real. A flu pandemic spreading from Asia was dramatized in 1993. An equation that appeared to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle was written on a chalkboard in 1998, 14 years before the particle was experimentally confirmed. The internet, when it noticed, responded with the predictable mixture of amazement and suspicion. Articles were written, videos were made. People who hadn't thought about The Simpsons in years were suddenly sharing screenshots and asking the same question over and over again. How did they know? It's a reasonable question. It's actually a fascinating question, and tonight we're going to sit with it properly. We're going to go through each major prediction one by one, slowly, giving each one the space it deserves. We're going to look at what the show actually depicted, what the real-world event actually was, how closely they align, and what the explanation might be or might not be, because some of these coincidences are harder to explain away than others. The writers themselves have addressed this. Al Jean, who has been an executive producer on the show for most of its run, has spoken about the predictions in interviews. His answer is consistent and a little deflating in the best possible way. He talks about volume, 800 episodes, thousands of jokes, hundreds of satirical extrapolations about where American culture, technology, and politics were heading. When you produce that much content over that long a period, some of it is going to land on the future by pure statistical probability. It's the dartboard theory. Throw enough darts at a large enough board for long enough, and some of them are going to hit the bullseye even by accident. The ones that miss are forgotten. The ones that hit get screenshotted and shared and discussed and turned into YouTube videos and Reddit threads. Confirmation bias does the rest of the work. That explanation is probably correct for most of the predictions. Probably. But there's a version of this story that's more interesting than pure chance, and it doesn't require anything supernatural to believe it. The writers of The Simpsons, particularly during the show's peak years in the 1990s, were genuinely extraordinary observers of American culture. The writing staff included people with degrees from Harvard, Yale, and other elite institutions. Several had backgrounds in mathematics, physics, economics, and political science. These were not people who wrote jokes by instinct alone. They were people who studied the world carefully, identified where trends were heading, and then pushed those trends to their logical extremes for comedic effect. That process, done rigorously and done repeatedly over decades, produces something that looks a great deal like prophecy from the outside. It isn't prophecy, it's pattern recognition with very good writers attached to it. And then there's the third possibility, the one that the show's own creator has, in certain moods, seemed almost willing to entertain. The possibility that The Simpsons doesn't just reflect American culture, but in some strange recursive way actually shapes it. That a joke made in 1995 doesn't just predict a future, it helps create one. That a satirical image planted in the collective consciousness of 100 million viewers changes how those viewers think about certain possibilities, makes certain futures feel more familiar, more inevitable, more like something that was always going to happen. We'll come back to that idea toward the end of tonight's journey. It's worth holding on to it as we go through the predictions, because it adds a different kind of weight to some of them. For now, though, let's just settle in. The premise for tonight is simple. We're going to go through the great predictions of The Simpsons, the ones that made people stop and stare, one by one. Each story gets the time it deserves. Each one has more to it than the headline. And by the end, we'll have spent a long, comfortable night in Springfield, which, when you think about it, is exactly what the show has always invited you to do. Close your eyes if you want. Let the words come in slowly. You don't need to remember all of this. You don't need to take notes. Just listen, and let Springfield open itself up around you the way it always does, improbable and warm and somehow, inexplicably, familiar. Let's begin. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'd genuinely love to know. And if you haven't already, subscribing means you'll never miss one of these long-form nights. The prediction that broke the internet? The year 2000 feels like a long time ago now. The world had just survived the anxiety of Y2K, that strange collective fear that the turning of the calendar might somehow cause computers to forget what year it was and bring civilization quietly to its knees. The internet existed, but it was slower and smaller and louder in a dial-up sort of way, full of pages that took 40 seconds to load and message boards where strangers argued about things that mattered only to them. The most popular movie in American cinemas was Gladiator. The most watched television program was Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? And on March 19th of that year, a Simpsons episode called Bart to the Future aired on Fox, went largely unremarked upon by the general public, and then waited 16 years to become one of the most talked-about pieces of television ever produced. The episode's premise is a familiar Simpsons structure, a flash-forward narrative, the show imagining what life might look like for the Simpson family at some point in the future. In this version, Bart is a grown adult, lazy and directionless, and charming in the way that some people never quite grow out of being. He's playing in a band that never quite gets anywhere. He's borrowing money he never quite pays back. He is, in the gentlest possible terms, not making the most of his potential. Lisa, by contrast, has done extraordinarily well. Lisa Simpson is, in this imagined future, the President of the United States. She is the first, the episode specifies, to be a very brainy young lady. She is thoughtful and principled and slightly exhausted by the weight of the office, which is consistent with every version of Lisa the show has ever depicted. And in one of the episode's early scenes, she sits in the Oval Office with her advisors and delivers a line that, in March of 2000, was a throwaway joke. She refers to having inherited a budget surplus from her predecessor, and her predecessor, the outgoing president whose administration she has inherited, is identified as Donald Trump. The name is spoken casually. It's a background joke, a quick satirical gesture toward the absurdity of celebrity culture and the direction American politics seemed to be heading at that particular historical moment. It got a laugh. The episode moved on. And then 16 years later, Donald Trump descended an escalator in Trump Tower, announced his candidacy for President of the United States, and won. The screenshots went everywhere. The clip was shared millions of times. News outlets that hadn't covered a Simpsons episode in years suddenly had pieces about it. The phrase "The Simpsons predicted" it became a meme that spread far beyond anyone who'd ever watched the show. People who had grown up watching The Simpsons as children, who hadn't thought about it in a decade, found themselves pulling up clips on their phones and staring at a cartoon from the year 2000 with a feeling that's hard to name precisely. It wasn't quite shock. It was more like the feeling you get when a dream you forgot you had suddenly makes sense in the context of your waking day. A kind of retrospective recognition. Oh, yes. Of course, that's how it looked from there. But let's be careful here, because the closer you look at this prediction, the more interesting it becomes, and the more complicated. The show did not predict that Donald Trump would become president. That's a slightly inflated version of what happened. What the show depicted was a satirical future in which a celebrity businessman who had spent years cultivating a brand of ostentatious wealth and public visibility had somehow ended up in the White House. It used Trump's name because Trump, in the year 2000, was already one of the most recognizable symbols of exactly that kind of celebrity. He was a shorthand, a cultural signifier. Trump had been a fixture of American public life since the 1980s. He had appeared on the covers of magazines, hosted television programs, attached his name to casinos and towers and airlines and a board game. He had, crucially, floated the idea of running for president on multiple occasions before the year 2000, as far back as 1987, when he took out full-page newspaper advertisements talking about American decline. In 1999, he had briefly pursued the Reform Party nomination for the presidency before withdrawing. He was not an obscure figure in 2000. He was not an unexpected choice for a satirical joke about celebrity politics. What the writers of Bart to the Future were doing, almost certainly, was not prophecy. They were extrapolation. They saw a trajectory, a line that American culture seemed to be moving along, and they followed that line to where it logically ended. Celebrity culture was eating politics. Fame was becoming its own form of qualification. The idea that someone famous enough, rich enough, and brazen enough might eventually end up in the most powerful office in the world was already, in the year 2000, a recognizable anxiety in American life. The Simpsons just gave that anxiety a name. Writer Dan Greeny, who wrote Bart to the Future, has spoken about this directly. He has described the joke as being intended as a warning, a way of showing what the end of certain trends looks like when you follow them all the way out. It wasn't a prediction so much as a diagnosis. This is what happens, the episode was saying, if you keep going in the direction you're already going. It was a signpost, not a crystal ball. But here's the thing that makes the Trump prediction genuinely strange, even after you've absorbed all of that context. The episode didn't just say Trump would be president. It specified the conditions of that presidency in ways that turned out to be oddly accurate. Lisa is dealing with a massive budget deficit left over from the previous administration, a deficit that she describes with barely concealed frustration as enormous, unprecedented, requiring serious and difficult solutions. The satirical point in 2000 was that a Trump presidency would leave the country in financial chaos. In 2021, when the Biden administration inherited an economy shaped by the Trump years, the conversation about debt and deficits was one of the central political discussions of the moment. That's probably coincidence. Budget deficits are a constant feature of American political life, and satirists have been joking about the gap between presidential promises and fiscal reality since long before The Simpsons existed. But the specificity of it, the way it layered detail on top of detail, gives the whole thing a quality that's harder to simply dismiss. There's also the visual element that people often miss when discussing this prediction. The screenshot that spread across the internet in 2016 showed Trump descending on an escalator in Trump Tower during his campaign announcement. That image, the golden interior, the branded backdrop, the escalator descent, became one of the defining visual moments of the entire 2016 campaign season. It was strange and theatrical and somehow very Trumpian, a grand entrance from above. And in the Simpsons episode from 2000, there is a brief sequence in which Trump's image appears associated with exactly that kind of visual language. Gilded, descended from above, slightly absurd in its grandeur. The writers didn't plan that. They couldn't have. But the visual rhyme between the cartoon and the reality landed in people's memories, like something that had been designed that way. Because The Simpsons had, for decades, been drawing Trump as a certain kind of figure, and that figure had a consistent visual vocabulary. When Trump's actual campaign imagery turned out to share elements of that vocabulary, it felt like confirmation of something. Whether it was confirmation of anything is a different question. The Trump prediction became the foundational text of The Simpsons Predicts the Future discourse. Once it went viral in 2016, people went looking for other examples with fresh eyes and real motivation. The episode had primed them. They knew what they were looking for, and they found it. Some of what they found was real. Some of it was retrofitting, taking things the show had done and matching them to real events with a generous definition of what counts as a match. The internet is very good at finding patterns, and it is not always careful about distinguishing patterns that exist from patterns that are imposed. But the Trump prediction stayed as a kind of cornerstone. Even the skeptical analysts, the fact-checkers who went through the predictions one by one and rated them on specificity and accuracy, tended to acknowledge that this one was striking, not supernatural, not impossible to explain, but striking. Because 16 years is a long time to be right about something. The Simpsons in 2000 looked at the direction of American celebrity culture, pushed it to an absurd extreme, attached a famous name to that extreme, and called the shot a decade and a half before it landed. The margin for error on that kind of prediction is enormous. The variables that could have changed, that would have prevented it from coming true, are almost uncountable. Trump could have decided not to run in 2016. He could have run and lost. The political conditions that made his victory possible could have shifted in any number of directions. But they didn't. And the cartoon from the year 2000 sat there, patient and unchanged, waiting for reality to catch up with it. What makes this prediction worth dwelling on for a moment longer is what it says about the nature of satire itself. Good satire doesn't invent futures. It looks at presents and describes their logical endpoints. When the endpoint arrives, the satire looks like prophecy. When it doesn't, it looks like a joke that didn't quite land. The Simpsons was writing jokes about the logical endpoints of American culture for decades. Most of the endpoints it imagined were too absurd, too specific, too dependent on particular combinations of circumstance to actually materialize. But the Trump one was based on trends that were already deeply embedded in American culture, trends that were, in retrospect, far more powerful and far more durable than anyone realized at the time. Dan Greeny has said he wishes it hadn't come true, that the joke was funnier when it was impossible, that having the prediction validated felt less like a triumph than like watching something you wrote as a reductio ad absurdum arrive in the real world and not behave absurdly at all. That's perhaps the most Simpsons thing about the Trump prediction. The show looked at something dark, turned it into a joke to make it bearable, and then the darkness showed up anyway, right on schedule, with the joke already attached to it. Let's stay in the year 2000 for just another moment before we move forward, because the Bart to the Future episode contains another detail that gets less attention than the Trump reference, but that is, in its own way, equally strange. In the episode, Lisa is dealing with the financial fallout of the Trump administration. She is also dealing with diplomatic tensions, with a world that seems to have become more complicated and more fractious during the years of her predecessor's presidency. Her administration is defined, in part, by the work of trying to repair relationships and restore credibility that had been damaged before she arrived. In January of 2021, those words would not have seemed like satire. They would have seemed like a news summary. The Simpsons wrote that sentence in the year 2000, before the September 11th attacks, before the Iraq War, before the 2008 financial crisis, before the Obama presidency, before the Trump presidency, before any of the events that would make those words feel like an accurate description of a specific real moment. They wrote it because it was funny, and because it followed logically from the satirical premise, and because the writers understood that any administration inherits the complications of the one before it. But it landed somewhere very specific. That's the thing about the Trump prediction that gets lost in the excitement over the escalator and the name. The prediction wasn't just about who would be president. It was about what that presidency would leave behind. And that, in some ways, is the more unsettling accuracy. The name was a guess, informed by cultural observation. The aftermath was structural. It was baked into the logic of what a presidency like that one would inevitably produce. And The Simpsons got both right. Not through prophecy, through the steady, patient, careful attention of writers who understood American culture well enough to follow its threads to their ends. Flu, masks, and murder hornets. In 1993, the world was not thinking about pandemics. There was no widespread cultural anxiety about the possibility of a global respiratory illness spreading from Asia and bringing normal life to a halt. The concept existed in academic and public health circles. The infrastructure of infectious disease response had been quietly developing for decades, but it was not part of the daily conversation of ordinary people. AIDS was the dominant public health crisis of that era, and it was catastrophic enough to occupy most of the available attention. A flu pandemic felt like history, something that had happened in 1918 and was tragic and enormous but safely in the past. In September of that year, The Simpsons aired an episode called Marge in Chains. The episode was primarily a story about Marge. She is overwhelmed by the demands of running her household, exhausted by the constant labor of keeping everything moving, and eventually makes a small mistake at the Quickie Mart that leads to her being arrested for shoplifting, tried, and briefly imprisoned. It is, in the way that the best Simpsons episodes always manage to be, both very funny and genuinely affecting. Marge's exhaustion felt real. The community's abandonment of her felt real. Her quiet dignity in the face of it felt real. But the episode opens with something that has nothing to do with Marge's arc. There is a flu sweeping Springfield. The illness, identified in the episode as Osaka flu, has traveled from Japan via a television set that was shipped to Springfield and sneezed on during a live broadcast. The infected packages arrive at the Quick E-Mart. People buy them. They bring them home. And within days, almost every resident of Springfield is sick. The symptoms are dramatic. People are lying in bed, unable to move, feverish and miserable. The town's medical infrastructure is strained. The hospital is overwhelmed. Apu, running the Quickie Mart through his own illness because there is nobody else to run it, is spreading the virus to every customer who comes through the door. The town runs out of medicine. There is a community meeting to figure out how to respond. The discussion becomes heated and eventually absurd, as Springfield meetings always do. At one point, a statue of a local hero is proposed as a solution, because nothing focuses community anxiety like the suggestion of a large monument. The episode treats the flu as a backdrop, a premise that gets the characters into the situations the writers want to explore. But the backdrop is remarkably specific. A respiratory illness, Asian in origin, spread through contaminated consumer goods. overwhelming an underprepared healthcare system, creating supply shortages, generating community anxiety that expresses itself in public meetings and arguments, and the search for solutions that feel more like gestures than actual remedies. When COVID-19 arrived in early 2020, people found margin chains quickly. The screenshots spread. The headlines wrote themselves. The Simpsons predicted the pandemic. Let's be fair about what the episode actually did and didn't get right. The show did not predict COVID-19 specifically. The Osaka flu is an influenza, not a coronavirus. It spreads through contaminated goods rather than respiratory transmission between people. The timescale of the epidemic in the episode is compressed to fit the story, and the episode is set entirely within Springfield, a single small town, rather than depicting anything like a global pandemic. What the episode got right was more structural. A novel illness from Asia arriving in the United States via global trade networks and spreading rapidly through a population with no immunity to it is not a prediction. It is a description of how pandemics work. The kind of description that any reasonably informed person in 1993 could have constructed from existing public health knowledge. The writers did their research, or they had access to people who had, and they used the mechanics of epidemic spread as a story device, with enough fidelity to the real thing that it reads, from 2020, like something more than fiction. The detail that became particularly discussed in 2020 was a brief moment in the episode where a crate arrives in Springfield, and the crowd gathers around it with barely concealed anxiety. When the crate is opened, it releases a swarm of killer bees, which then disperse across Springfield, adding chaos to the already chaotic flu situation. This detail resurfaced in a very specific way in the spring of 2020. In April of that year, as the United States was still coming to terms with the scope of the COVID-19 outbreak, news broke that Asian giant hornets, substantially larger and more dangerous than typical hornets, had been discovered in the Pacific Northwest. They are, technically, a genuine pest, capable of destroying honeybee colonies and delivering a sting painful enough to be dangerous to humans. The media, searching for a shorthand that would convey their alarming nature, settled on the term murder hornets. Murder hornets arrived during a pandemic. The Simpsons episode from 1993 depicted a killer bee release during a pandemic. These are not the same thing. Asian giant hornets are not killer bees in any technical sense. The pandemic in the episode is an influenza, not COVID. The bees in the episode are explicitly a separate incident, a bizarre coincidence within the show's universe rather than a consequence of the flu. But the visual and emotional rhyme between the two moments, a pandemic plus the sudden, terrifying introduction of dangerous insects into the public consciousness at the same moment, was close enough and strange enough that it dominated the Simpsons predictions conversation in those early months of 2020. It is worth noting, because this is the kind of context that tends to get lost, that the murder hornet story was significantly overstated by the media. The hornets were a real pest and genuinely concerning for beekeepers in the affected region, but they were not the civilizational threat that some coverage implied. The story was amplified by a media ecosystem that was already in a state of elevated anxiety because of the pandemic, and the hornets became a symbol of the feeling that the world was somehow releasing multiple disasters simultaneously. The fact that The Simpsons, from 1993, had depicted exactly that feeling, multiple disasters arriving at once with a kind of absurdist simultaneity, was the thing that resonated. There is another layer to the margin chain story that gets less attention. The Springfield town meeting, convened to address the flu crisis, is a masterpiece of satirical observation. The residents are frightened. They want solutions. They want someone to tell them that everything is going to be okay and that the people in charge have a plan. What they get instead is chaos, competing proposals, and a growing sense that the official channels are not equal to the scale of the problem. At one point, a doctor proposes a rational, measured public health response. He is ignored. At another point, someone proposes something that sounds more like a gesture than a solution, a symbolic act that would make people feel better without actually addressing the problem. This is received with considerably more enthusiasm. If you watch that meeting in 2020, during the actual pandemic, with your actual phone in your actual hand scrolling through actual news coverage, the satirical point did not feel like exaggeration. It felt like a transcript. The show was not predicting the specific failures of the COVID-19 response. It was depicting the general pattern of how human communities respond to health crises, a pattern that has been consistent enough across history that a careful observer in 1993 could describe it with reasonable accuracy. Fear creates demand for reassurance. Reassurance creates incentive to offer symbolic solutions. Symbolic solutions generate arguments about which symbol is most reassuring, and the actual problem continues to develop while the arguments are happening. This is not a new observation. Public health scholars had been writing about it for decades before The Simpsons made a joke about it. But the joke landed in a very specific place in 2020, because the pattern it was describing was unfolding in real time at a scale none of the writers of Marge and Chains had imagined. The pandemic prediction has a different emotional quality from the Trump prediction. The Trump prediction is about politics and celebrity and the particular trajectory of American public life. It has a certain wry, knowing quality, a joke that turned out to be true in a way that feels darkly satisfying even as it shouldn't. The pandemic prediction is about suffering, about people getting sick and overwhelmed healthcare systems and communities struggling to coordinate a response, and the particular loneliness of being ill in a world that isn't sure how to help you. The fact that The Simpsons touch those things, even lightly, even as backdrop for a different story, gives the prediction a weight that's harder to carry lightly. Marge gets released from prison eventually. The flu passes. Springfield goes back to normal, as Springfield always does. But the episode had, for a few brief minutes, looked at something very dark and described it with uncomfortable clarity. And 27 years later, reality caught up with it. There is one more detail from the pandemic episode that deserves mention, because it gets overlooked in the rush to discuss killer bees and Osaka flu. In the episode, one of the responses to the shortage of supplies is panic buying. Residents of Springfield, terrified of the spreading illness and the uncertainty it creates, buy far more than they need of basic goods. Shelves empty. Certain items become impossible to find. People hoard. In March of 2020, the image of empty toilet paper shelves became one of the defining visual symbols of the early pandemic. It was, like much of what actually happened, both genuinely alarming and deeply absurd. Something about the specific panic over that specific product captured something true about the way fear expresses itself in consumer behavior. The Simpsons in 1993 depicted exactly that behavior. People in Springfield hoarding goods during a health crisis, stripping shelves bare, making rational provision impossible through the accumulation of individual irrational responses. Again, this is not a mystery. Panic buying during public health crises is documented behavior that goes back centuries. The writers of Marge and Chains were not inventing something. They were drawing on known human patterns. But the specificity of the resonance, the way the real events of 2020 kept finding their reflections in a cartoon episode from 1993, gives the whole thing a quality that it's hard to describe without reaching for words like uncanny. Springfield has always been America. The pandemic episode is one of the clearest examples of what that actually means. Smartwatches, video calls, and the autocorrect nightmare. Technology prediction is, in some ways, the category where The Simpsons gets the most credit and perhaps deserves the least of it. Not because the predictions aren't real, some of them are genuinely striking, but because predicting technological development is structurally easier than predicting political or social events. Technology follows visible trajectories. Computers get smaller. Networks get faster. Devices converge. The smartphone was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention to the direction electronics had been moving since the 1970s. The smartwatch was not a surprise to anyone who had watched computers get small enough to fit in a pocket and thought, where does that trend end? The Simpsons writers were paying attention to those trajectories. They were, as we've established, a remarkably educated and observant group of people. And they made jokes about technology that, from the vantage point of subsequent decades, look like predictions. But let's look at them carefully, because some are more impressive than others. The smartwatch appears in the Season 6 episode Lisa's Wedding, which aired in March of 1995. This is the flash-forward episode, the one that imagines a future approximately 15 years ahead in which Lisa is engaged to be married. The future the episode depicts is filled with technology that was not available in 1995. There are video calls. There is a kind of sophisticated personal communication device. And there is, visible briefly on a character's wrist, something that looks unmistakably like a smartwatch. The Apple Watch was released in April of 2015. Samsung's Galaxy Gear came out in 2013. The Pebble smartwatch, often credited as the device that proved there was consumer interest in wearable computing, arrived in 2012. The Simpsons depicted a wristwatch capable of advanced communication functions in 1995, roughly 17 years before consumer smartwatches became a real product category. That is the headline version. But let's look at the context. By 1995, the concept of wearable computing was not new or obscure. The MIT Media Lab had been doing research into wearable technology since the late 1980s. Dick Tracy, the comic strip hero, had been using a wrist radio since 1946 and the two-way wrist TV since 1964. The idea that a wristwatch might eventually incorporate communication and computing functions was, by 1995, a standard science fiction premise. It appeared in countless novels, films, and television programs before The Simpsons used it. The writers of Lisa's Wedding did not invent the concept of the smartwatch. They borrowed a familiar futuristic image and placed it in their version of the near future, which was exactly what they were supposed to do. That said, the episode's vision of near-future technology is strikingly holistic in a way that distinguishes it from generic sci-fi speculation. It doesn't just imagine one or two individual gadgets. It imagines an ecosystem, a world in which multiple technologies have advanced in parallel and created a genuinely different daily experience. Video calls are normal. Personal communication devices are ubiquitous. Information is accessible in ways that feel continuous rather than interrupted. The texture of the technological future the episode depicts is recognizable to anyone living in the 2010s in a way that goes beyond any single device. That holistic quality is harder to explain away as borrowing familiar tropes. It suggests writers who had genuinely internalized the trajectory of technological development and extrapolated it coherently rather than just inserting a few futuristic props. The video call prediction deserves its own moment. The Simpsons depicted video calling long before it became part of everyday life, not in one episode but repeatedly, across multiple episodes and years. The technology appears casually, as a background element, in ways that suggest the writers considered it an obvious near-future development rather than a dramatic futuristic reveal. Video telephony was not a new concept by the early 1990s. AT&T had demonstrated a picture phone at the 1964 World's Fair. The technology continued to develop slowly over subsequent decades. But video calls as a daily household norm, as the kind of thing anyone might do without remarking on it, the kind of thing depicted in the backgrounds of Simpsons scenes, did not arrive until FaceTime and Skype and Zoom made them trivially easy. The show treated the technology as inevitable long before it was convenient. Now, let's talk about autocorrect, because this one is a little different. The episode is called Lisa on Ice, from Season 6 in 1994. There is a brief sequence in which a character uses what appears to be a personal digital assistant to take notes. The device misinterprets what the character says. Instead of writing what was intended, it produces something nonsensical. The joke is about the unreliability of voice or text interpretation software, the gap between what a person means and what a machine understands. By 1994, this was a recognizable frustration for anyone who had used early voice recognition software or the autocorrect functions on early mobile devices. The technology existed. It was just not yet part of most people's daily lives. When smartphones became ubiquitous and autocorrect became a universal experience in the late 2000s, the specific flavor of frustration the episode depicted became one of the most shared experiences of the digital age. The gap between intention and machine interpretation that The Simpsons joked about in 1994 became the subject of entire social media accounts, comedy routines, and genuine cultural frustration. The prediction here is not really about autocorrect specifically. It's about the persistent inadequacy of machine interpretation, the comedy of the gap between what humans mean and what machines understand. That gap was real in 1994, and it remained real in the age of smartphones, and it remains real now in the age of voice assistants that mishear your requests and smart speakers that misunderstand your commands. The writers of The Simpsons were not predicting a specific technology. They were identifying a structural problem with human-machine communication that has remained consistent across multiple generations of technology. That's less of a prediction than it is an insight, and insights, properly articulated, tend to stay relevant for a long time. There's one technology prediction that doesn't get discussed as much as the smartwatch, but that is, in certain respects, more interesting. In a 1994 episode, the show depicted something that looks very much like a modern electronic tablet, a flat-screen device capable of displaying information and being interacted with directly. At the time, tablet computers were a research concept and a rare experimental product, not consumer technology. The first iPad arrived in 2010. The show didn't describe the device in detail. It appeared as part of a background scene, a casual prop in a world that was already imagining portable screens as normal. But the visual, looking back from the age of ubiquitous tablets, is striking. What makes the technology predictions worth thinking about collectively, as a category, is not any individual device or capability. It's the way the show's vision of the future consistently prioritized connectivity and portability and the convergence of communication functions into single, personal devices. That was the direction technology was moving. The Simpsons, in the early 1990s, was already drawing a world in which that direction had reached its logical conclusion. They were not alone in this. Science fiction had been imagining pocket-sized communication and computing devices for decades, but the specific way The Simpsons imagined them, embedded in ordinary domestic life, used casually by unremarkable people in unremarkable situations, gave the predictions a texture that feels more accurate than most science fiction's version. In most science fiction, technology is dramatic. It's the point of the story. In The Simpsons, technology is background. It's just stuff that exists in the world. And that is, with some exceptions, exactly what technology has become. Your phone is not dramatic. It's furniture. The Simpsons was imagining furniture in 1995 that wouldn't arrive for another 15 years. That's not nothing. Even if the trajectory was predictable, getting the details right early enough for them to still feel surprising takes genuine imagination. Let's close this section with one more technology moment that gets less attention than it deserves. In a 1998 episode, a character uses a device to look up information in real time, accessing a kind of networked information system that provides answers on demand. This is, in a functional sense, a description of an internet search. Not a search engine in the specific technical sense, but the experience of information being available immediately on request, without visiting a library or calling an expert or waiting for anything. Google was founded in 1998, the same year the episode aired. The experience of genuinely useful real-time information search did not arrive for most people until several years later, when Google became the dominant tool and high-speed internet became widespread enough to make the experience feel frictionless. The Simpsons depicted the experience of on-demand information, the feeling of it, the casual expectation of it, in the same year the technology that would make it possible was being built in a garage in California. The two things are not connected. The writers didn't know about Google. Google didn't know about the Simpsons episode. But they were both responding to the same underlying trajectory, the same logical endpoint of decades of computing development. When two things respond to the same trajectory at the same moment, the results tend to rhyme. Springfield has always been very slightly ahead of itself. That's what makes it so useful as a mirror. How a cartoon saw corporate America coming. 21 years. That is the gap between the Simpsons episode that depicted Disney acquiring 20th Century Fox and the day in 2019 when that acquisition was actually completed. 21 years is a very long time to be right about something. The episode is called When You Dish Upon a Star, from Season 10. It aired on the 8th of November, 1998. The plot involves Homer stumbling upon the secret vacation hideaway of Alec Baldwin and Kim Basinger, the celebrity couple who were, at the time, among the most recognizable faces in American entertainment. Homer, being Homer, cannot keep a secret, and eventually blows the cover of their hideaway, generating chaos. But the prediction is not in the main story. It's in a background detail. Near the end of the episode, there is a brief shot of the 20th Century Fox logo, the famous golden fanfare. Beneath it, in small text, is a subtitle, A Division of Walt Disney Co. That's it. No scene devoted to it. No joke built around it. Just a background detail, a piece of signage in the show's universe, presented without comment. In 1998, this was a joke about media consolidation. The entertainment industry had been going through waves of mergers and acquisitions for decades. The trend toward larger and larger conglomerate ownership of media properties was well established and widely discussed. Fox itself was owned by News Corporation, Rupert Murdoch's empire. Disney was the dominant force in family entertainment. The idea that a company like Disney might eventually swallow a company like Fox was the kind of satirical extrapolation that follows naturally from watching corporate consolidation accelerate. The writers were not, in 1998, predicting a specific deal. They were making a joke about the direction of corporate media, the way everything was slowly being absorbed into a smaller and smaller number of hands. Disney was the most recognizable symbol of corporate dominance in entertainment, the company that had made itself synonymous with the totality of a certain kind of family entertainment experience. Fox was a major studio. The joke was, if this trend continues, eventually everything will be Disney. In March of 2019, Disney completed its acquisition of 21st Century Fox's entertainment assets for $71.3 billion. The studios, the television properties, the content libraries, all of it came under Disney's umbrella. The Simpsons, which had been a Fox show for 30 years, was now a Disney property. The show that had made the joke was now living inside the joke. There is something almost too perfect about that. The writers of When You Dish Upon a Star had used Disney as the most obvious possible symbol of corporate entertainment dominance, a shorthand that every viewer would understand immediately. And then the actual corporation matched the cartoon so precisely that they ended up owning the cartoon that had predicted them. The acquisition generated its own wave of Simpsons predicted-it coverage. The screenshot of the Fox logo with the Disney subtitle beneath it circulated everywhere. It was the kind of thing that, if you showed it to someone who didn't know the context, might briefly make them wonder whether time was working backwards. It wasn't. The context matters. By the early 2000s, the possibility of a Disney-Fox merger had been discussed in entertainment industry circles for years. The structural logic was clear. Disney's acquisition strategy, which had already brought it Pixar and would later bring it Marvel and Lucasfilm, pointed toward continued expansion. Fox's position in the media landscape, valuable but complicated by its association with News Corporation's broader media empire, made it a plausible acquisition target. The deal wasn't inevitable in 1998 or even in 2010, but it was conceivable, and the kind of people who pay attention to corporate media structure were conceiving of it. The Simpsons writers were, as noted earlier, extraordinary observers of American culture, and American corporate culture in particular. The show had always been interested in the dynamics of institutional power, in the way that concentrated wealth and media ownership shape the world that ordinary people live in without quite realizing it. Burns's empire, the Springfield power monopoly, was always a satirical comment on exactly those dynamics. The Disney joke was in the same tradition. It was less a prediction than a critique, a moment in which the show pointed at a trajectory and said, with characteristic Simpsons bluntness, this is where this is going. When it turned out to be going exactly there, the critique became something stranger than a critique. It became a document. The merger prediction has an interesting postscript. After Disney's acquisition of Fox was completed, there was some discussion about whether The Simpsons would continue to air, whether the show would be modified to accommodate Disney's ownership, whether the longtime Fox-era jokes about 20th Century Fox as a network would need to be retired or renegotiated. The show navigated this with its characteristic self-awareness, making jokes about its new corporate parentage that were both funny and slightly defensive. In one episode, a character looks at the Disney Corporation with a mixture of admiration and resignation. The joke is layered, self-aware, the show commenting on its own situation with the kind of meta-awareness it had always deployed when corporate realities intersected with the world of Springfield. But there's a deeper irony in the merger prediction that gets less attention than the simple fact of its accuracy. The Simpsons in 1998 used Disney as a symbol of corporate dominance precisely because Disney was already, by that point, a remarkable example of how a single company could achieve cultural saturation. Disney's theme parks, movies, merchandise, music, and television properties had achieved a kind of total presence in American family entertainment that had no real parallel. The joke about Disney absorbing Fox was a joke about that saturation, about a corporation that had made itself so necessary and so omnipresent that its eventual domination of everything adjacent to its existing territory was logically implied. In depicting this future, The Simpsons was also somewhat describing its own situation. The show had itself achieved a kind of cultural saturation. It was everywhere, quoted by everyone, a reference point for an entire generation's understanding of American family life and American culture. It had made Springfield the most recognizable fictional American town in history. And when Disney absorbed Fox and absorbed The Simpsons along with it, the show that had joked about corporate omnipresence became part of the most omnipresent entertainment corporation in American history. The joke didn't just come true, the show became part of the punchline. There is something quietly poetic about that, if you're in the right mood to find it poetic. The other thing worth saying about the Disney-Fox prediction is that it's a particularly clear example of what distinguishes the best Simpsons predictions from the merely coincidental ones. The merely coincidental predictions are specific events that happen to rhyme with something the show depicted. They're interesting, but they don't require any special quality in the writers to explain. The Disney prediction required something more. It required the writers to understand, in 1998, the structural logic of corporate media consolidation clearly enough to identify not just the direction of travel, but a specific likely endpoint. They named Disney. They named Fox. They put those names together in a relationship that the actual world did not create for another 21 years. That's not accident. That's analysis dressed as a joke. And that, more than anything else, is what The Simpsons has always been. Analysis dressed as jokes, observation dressed as absurdity, truth dressed in yellow skin and four fingers, speaking in a cartoon voice from a town that exists everywhere and nowhere, telling you what's coming before it arrives. Homer gets there first. In January of 1994, Homer Simpson went to space. The episode is called Deep Space Homer, and it is, by any reasonable assessment, one of the finest episodes the show ever produced. It is also, in the context of the predictions, one of the most layered, because the thing it predicted is not one single event but a whole category of events that took decades to arrive. The premise is this: NASA, in the show's universe, is struggling with low viewership for its broadcasts. The agency's television ratings are declining because space missions have become routine, familiar, no longer capable of generating the sense of wonder and excitement they once did. The public has simply stopped being amazed by space. To solve this problem, NASA decides to send an ordinary person to space. Not a scientist, not a test pilot, not an engineer. An average American, someone whose presence aboard a space shuttle will be relatable and interesting and will remind the public that space travel is remarkable by showing them someone experiencing it for the first time. Homer Simpson gets selected. He goes to space. There are complications. There are floating chips. There is a legendary ant farm sequence. It is, tonally, a perfect piece of Simpsons comedy, warm and absurd and somehow genuinely moving at the end when Homer, floating in the zero-gravity spacecraft, looks back at Earth and feels something real. And it features, in a brief supporting role, Buzz Aldrin, who plays himself. Buzz Aldrin, the second human to walk on the moon during the Apollo 11 mission, appeared on The Simpsons in 1994 and provided enthusiastic encouragement to Homer Simpson's amateur space adventure. Now let's talk about what happened next. Commercial space tourism did not exist in any meaningful way in 1994. The concept was science fiction, not reality. NASA was a government agency. Space travel was something that happened to astronauts, highly trained and carefully selected professionals who devoted their careers to earning the right to leave the planet. The idea of a private company selling tickets to space, or of an ordinary person paying their way onto a spacecraft, was the province of novels and optimistic long-range speculation. In 2001, Dennis Tito became the first space tourist, paying approximately $20 million to travel to the International Space Station. This was real, but narrow, expensive, and dependent on the Russian space program rather than any commercial operation. The real era of commercial space tourism arrived in the 2020s. SpaceX, Blue Origin, and Virgin Galactic all developed vehicles capable of carrying paying passengers into space or near space. Billionaires went to space. Celebrities went to space. The list of people who have left Earth's atmosphere expanded, slowly at first and then with increasing speed, beyond the community of professional astronauts. The Simpsons episode from 1994 did not predict this in detail. It predicted the underlying premise. The idea that space should be accessible to ordinary people, that there was something worth preserving in the public's relationship with space exploration, that the solution to declining interest in space was to make space more democratic rather than more specialized. These are ideas that eventually drove the commercial space tourism industry into existence. The show was not predicting SpaceX. It was identifying a cultural and institutional problem that SpaceX and its counterparts would eventually try to solve. The Buzz Aldrin element adds a specific resonance that deserves its own attention. Aldrin's appearance in the 1994 episode was not incidental. He appeared because the writers wanted to ground the absurdity of the premise in real NASA history and culture. Aldrin, who had spent years advocating for continued public engagement with space exploration after returning from the moon, was a natural fit for an episode about the importance of keeping space meaningful to ordinary Americans. The episode uses his presence not just for the credibility it lends, but for the emotional weight. Aldrin, who knows more viscerally than almost any human being what it means to leave the planet, is enthusiastic about Homer's mission because he understands that the public's connection to space depends on seeing it through eyes other than experts' eyes. That argument, made in a 1994 cartoon, became one of the central marketing arguments for commercial space tourism in the 2020s. SpaceX's mission statements, Virgin Galactic's branding, Blue Origin's public communications, all of them returned again and again to the idea that space should not be the exclusive property of governments and professionals, that the democratization of access to space was itself valuable, both economically and culturally. The Simpsons was making that argument in 1994, in the context of a comedy about Homer getting stuck in a vending machine before liftoff and befriending an inanimate object in microgravity, but making it nonetheless. There is a detail in Deep Space Homer that often gets overlooked in discussions of the episode's predictive elements. Near the beginning of the episode, before Homer is selected, there is a sequence in which the NASA officials discuss various potential ordinary American candidates. The criteria they use are interesting. They want someone who is genuinely ordinary, not just technically amateur but culturally recognizable. They want someone whose unfamiliarity with space will be legible to a television audience. That is essentially the casting brief for commercial space tourism content. The appeal of watching a celebrity or an influencer or a billionaire go to space is precisely their unfamiliarity with the experience. The audience projects themselves into the subject's wonder. The subject's ordinariness, relative to professional astronauts, is the point. The Simpsons described the entertainment logic of commercial space tourism in 1994 because the entertainment logic was already implicit in the institutional problem NASA was facing. When something extraordinary becomes routine, the way to restore the sense of wonder is to introduce someone for whom it is still extraordinary. That's not a prediction. It's an insight about how wonder works. But insights, when they're accurate, tend to generate accurate predictions. The episode also contains, somewhat inadvertently, a prediction about the nature of commercial space failures. Homer's mission does not go smoothly. There are multiple near disasters. The spacecraft is damaged. There is a period of genuine uncertainty about whether the astronauts will survive. The resolution is provided not by NASA expertise but by Homer's accidental discovery of a solution while looking for potato chips. This is comedy, obviously, but the texture of it, the sense of a mission held together by improvisation and luck, and the specific absurdity of human presence in a deeply inhospitable environment, describes something true about all crewed spaceflight, commercial and governmental alike. The missions that capture the public's imagination most powerfully tend to be the ones that go wrong in interesting ways and come right again. Apollo 13. Various SpaceX launch sequences that ended with landings that nobody was entirely sure would work. The drama of space travel, as the public experiences it, is the drama of the gap between ambition and capability, between what we're trying to do and what we can actually manage. Homer in space is an extreme version of that gap. But the emotional truth of it, the anxiety and the relief and the unexpected competence emerging from apparent incompetence, is not so far from the thing that makes actual space travel compelling to watch. Let's take a moment here to appreciate the Buzz Aldrin cameo on its own terms, separate from the prediction discussion, because it's genuinely remarkable as a piece of television. Aldrin walked on the moon in July of 1969. He was, along with Neil Armstrong, one of the two human beings who had made that particular journey. His presence in the show represents an extraordinary compression of the distance between human achievement and cartoon absurdity. Here is a man who stood on a celestial body and looked back at Earth from 250,000 miles away, and he is enthusiastically encouraging a cartoon father with a crayon lodged in his brain to pursue his dream of space travel. There is something genuinely moving about that, if you sit with it. The willingness of someone who has actually done the extraordinary thing to celebrate someone who only wants to do a small version of it. The way genuine accomplishment, rather than dismissing amateur aspiration, tends to honor it. The episode understood something about Aldrin's public character that his actual presence validated. He is not a man who guards the exclusivity of the experience. He is a man who has spent 50 years trying to get more people interested in the possibility of leaving the planet. That quality made him the perfect guest for that particular episode, and his willingness to appear in it, to lend his actual biography and his actual name to a cartoon comedy about space tourism, is itself a small piece of the larger story about the relationship between expert achievement and public imagination. Homer Simpson is not the first person to go to space, and he is not the most qualified, and he makes every possible mistake along the way. But he goes. And in going, he proves the point the episode was making all along. Space is not just for astronauts. It just took a few more decades for reality to catch up. When a cartoon beat particle physics, this one requires a little patience. Not much, but a little. The story is worth taking slowly, because the science underneath it is genuinely beautiful, and the coincidence, if it is a coincidence, is one of the strangest in the show's history. In October of 1998, The Simpsons aired an episode called The Wizard of Evergreen Terrace. The plot involves Homer becoming obsessed with Thomas Edison after watching a documentary and deciding that he, too, wants to become a great inventor. He sets up a workshop in the basement of the family home. He experiments with various devices. He does math on a chalkboard. The chalkboard scene is brief. Homer stands at a blackboard, covered in equations, working through some kind of calculation that the episode does not explain or dwell on. It's a background moment, a visual shorthand for the idea that Homer is engaging with serious intellectual work, which is funny because Homer is not known for serious intellectual work. But in 2013, a physicist named Simon Singh was analyzing the episode for a book he was writing about The Simpsons and mathematics. Singh paused on the chalkboard scene and looked at the equations carefully. One of them appeared to predict the mass of the Higgs boson particle. Let me explain what that means, because it requires a small digression into particle physics. Not a long one, just enough to understand why this is remarkable. The Higgs boson is a subatomic particle predicted by theoretical physicists in the 1960s as part of what became known as the Standard Model of Particle Physics, our best current description of the fundamental constituents of matter and energy. The Higgs boson was theorized to be the mechanism by which particles acquire mass, the thing that makes matter heavy rather than weightless. Without it, the Standard Model doesn't work. With it, the model is complete. Physicists spent 50 years trying to find the Higgs boson experimentally. The search required the construction of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, the most complex and expensive scientific instrument in human history, a circular tunnel, 27 kilometers in circumference, buried beneath the border between France and Switzerland. In July 2012, after decades of effort and billions of dollars of investment, physicists announced that they had confirmed the existence of the Higgs boson. The mass they measured for the particle was approximately 125 giga-electron-volts. The equation on Homer Simpson's chalkboard, written in 1998 by a writer on The Simpsons, produces a prediction of approximately 775 giga-electron-volts for the Higgs boson mass. This is not a perfect match. 775 is not 125. The equation on the chalkboard does not precisely predict the confirmed mass of the particle. But here's the thing. It's in the right ballpark in a way that matters. In 1998, the mass of the Higgs boson was entirely unknown. Physicists had theoretical constraints on what it could be, but those constraints left a very wide range of possible values, from a few tens of giga-electron-volts to hundreds. The equation on Homer's chalkboard produces a value that is within the plausible range, a value that could have been correct given what was known at the time. The equation itself is real physics. It's not made up. Whoever wrote that equation, and we'll get to who that was in a moment, was engaging with actual theoretical physics, with the real mathematical framework of particle mass prediction. The person who wrote it was David X. Cohen, then a writer on The Simpsons and now a producer on Futurama, who has a degree in physics from Harvard and a graduate degree in computer science from UC Berkeley. He is not a professional particle physicist, but he is someone with genuine scientific training who understood the mathematical framework well enough to construct a plausible-looking equation. Cohen has acknowledged the equation and the similarity to the eventual Higgs boson measurement. His explanation is characteristically precise. He was aware of the theoretical physics. He constructed an equation that was consistent with what was known at the time. The value it produces is in the plausible range but not accurate. He was doing actual science-adjacent math, not guessing randomly, but he was not predicting the confirmed value of the particle. This is an important distinction. The equation is not a prediction of the Higgs boson mass in the way that a direct calculation would be. It's more like a sophisticated joke, a piece of real mathematics placed in a comedic context by someone who understood the mathematics well enough to make it look right. But Simon Singh's observation, that this equation produces a value in the right order of magnitude for the eventual discovery, is accurate. And the fact that it does so 14 years before the discovery was announced, written on a chalkboard in the background of a joke about Homer wanting to be Thomas Edison, is genuinely striking. Singh published his analysis in his book The Simpsons and Their Mathematical Secrets in 2013, the year after the Higgs boson discovery was announced. The timing of his publication, the fact that he was examining the equation and its implications just as the particle's existence was being confirmed, gave the story a particular freshness and immediacy. Cohen, for his part, has been graciously self-deprecating about it. He did not predict the Higgs boson mass. He wrote an equation that was in the neighborhood of the correct answer, using real physics, in a context that nobody expected real physics to appear. But there's a quality to this particular prediction, even with all those qualifications, that distinguishes it from most of the others. The Trump prediction was a satirical extrapolation of cultural trends. The pandemic prediction was an application of known public health patterns. The technology predictions were extrapolations of visible developmental trajectories. All of those required observation and inference, genuine skills, but they were fundamentally about observing what was already visible and following it forward. The Higgs boson equation is different. It requires knowledge of theoretical physics that is genuinely not publicly accessible in any casual sense. You cannot predict the approximate mass of a theoretical particle without engaging with the actual mathematics of particle physics. Cohen did engage with that mathematics, and the value he got was plausible enough to be notable when the actual measurement came back 14 years later. That's not observation, that's calculation. The kind of calculation that requires genuine expertise. What this particular prediction says about the Simpsons writing staff is perhaps the most interesting thing about it. This was a show that employed people who could, as a background detail in a visual joke, write a real physics equation that produced a plausible approximate value for an undiscovered particle. The depth of expertise available to those writers, the range of disciplines they could draw on for a joke that would last approximately 2 seconds on screen, is itself a kind of remarkable thing. Most television shows write jokes. The Simpsons, at its peak, was doing theoretical physics as a byproduct of jokes about Thomas Edison. The Higgs boson equation is, in the taxonomy of Simpsons predictions, probably the most technically impressive one. Whether or not it counts as a true prediction, whether 775 and 125 are close enough, given the uncertainty of the pre-discovery period, is a question physicists can argue about. But the fact that it exists at all, that a writer on a cartoon sitcom constructed a real equation that gestures toward the right answer, is a testament to something extraordinary about the show. The universe, it turns out, is more Simpsons than we thought. Or perhaps The Simpsons, for a moment, was more universe than we expected. The darkest coincidence in the show's history. Some predictions are delightful, some are uncanny, some are simply strange in ways that resist easy description. And then there is the Siegfried and Roy prediction. This one is different from the others. Not because it is more specific, though it is quite specific. Not because the timing is more dramatic, though the timing is striking. It is different because the event it predicted was a tragedy. A real person was seriously hurt. And the proximity of the fictional depiction to the real event gives the whole thing a quality that neither the writers of the episode nor the people who later noticed the similarity could have wanted. Let's approach this one carefully and respectfully. Siegfried Fischbacher and Roy Horn were one of the most famous entertainment acts in the world for several decades. Based in Las Vegas, they performed elaborate stage shows combining magic with the presence of live exotic animals, most famously a collection of rare white tigers and white lions. Their shows were technically sophisticated and visually spectacular. They were, for many years, one of the highest-grossing entertainment acts in Las Vegas history. In 1993, The Simpsons aired an episode called Dollar Pringfield, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Legalized Gambling. The episode deals with the arrival of legalized gambling in Springfield and the various ways this transforms the town. Among the many subplots is the introduction of two performers who are unmistakably modeled on Siegfried and Roy. They are German, they perform magic, and they work with large exotic cats. In the episode, one of the white tigers attacks one of the performers during the show. The scene is played for broad comedy. The performer is mauled in a cartoony way, and the show moves on. It is not dwelt upon. It is not presented as shocking within the episode's emotional logic. It is part of the satire of Las Vegas spectacle and excess. The suggestion that the entertainment world trades in a kind of controlled danger that is always on the edge of becoming uncontrolled. On the 3rd of October 2003, Roy Horn was critically injured during a performance at the Mirage in Las Vegas when one of the act's white tigers bit him on the neck and dragged him off stage. Horn survived, but suffered severe neurological damage. He never fully recovered his previous physical capabilities. The attack ended his and Siegfried's performing career. The Simpsons episode aired in 1993. The attack on Roy Horn occurred in 2003, a 10-year gap between the fictional depiction and the real event. The specific elements that align: German performers with exotic cats, a white tiger, an attack during a performance. These are detailed enough that calling the similarity a coincidence requires acknowledging just how specific the coincidence is. The writers of the 1993 episode were almost certainly drawing on existing anxiety about the act. Siegfried and Roy's performances had always carried an undercurrent of real danger. Performing with large predatory animals is inherently risky. Audience members who watched the shows knew, on some level, that the animals were only cooperating because of extensive training and the particular relationship the performers had built with individual animals over years. The danger was part of the attraction. The Simpsons, in satirizing Las Vegas entertainment, reached for the most obvious and most available satirical observation about that specific act. The danger is real, and eventually the performance might not go as planned. The tiger scene in the episode is not a prediction so much as a satirical articulation of a risk that was already obvious to any careful observer. But 10 years later, the risk became reality. The exact scenario the show had depicted, stylistically heightened and played for comedy, played out in a real Las Vegas theater with real consequences. The writers could not have known. Nobody could have known. The relationship between Roy Horn and his animals had been built over decades and was, by all accounts, genuinely deep and mutual. The attack in 2003 was the result of a particular set of circumstances on a particular night, circumstances involving Horn's health and the animal's response to an unexpected situation. It was not a predictable outcome of the general risk. It was a specific convergence of factors. The fact that the show had depicted the general scenario a decade earlier is, in the strictest sense, the kind of thing that was statistically probable if you wrote enough jokes about Las Vegas entertainment acts that perform with dangerous animals. At some point, the act you're satirizing might have an incident that resembles the satire, but the specificity of the resemblance, white tigers, German performers, an attack during a performance, makes this harder to set aside as simple coincidence than most of the other predictions. What it requires, sitting with it, is a kind of careful emotional calibration. The prediction is remarkable. The event it preceded was a tragedy for a real person. Those two things exist simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other out. The show did not cause the attack. The show did not accelerate the attack. The show depicted a risk that was real, and the risk materialized a decade later in a form that was more specific than statistical probability strictly requires. Siegfried Fischbacher passed away in January of 2021. Roy Horn passed away in May of 2020 from complications related to COVID-19. Their careers, their partnership, their contribution to Las Vegas entertainment are part of the permanent record of what American spectacle was capable of being at a certain moment in the late 20th century. The Simpsons episode from 1993 is part of a different record. The record of what the show saw, and when it saw it, and how it held certain things up to satirical light before reality arrived, to give those things a different, heavier meaning. This one stays with you in a way that the other predictions don't, precisely because it is the only one that ends in genuine harm to a real person. It is a reminder that the show's observations, however sharp and however well constructed, were not neutral. They were drawn from real life, pointing at real people, touching on real risks. The fact that the risk was real is what made the satire work. And the fact that the risk materialized is what makes the prediction dark. We sit with that for a moment before moving on. We should sit with it for a moment. Some coincidences are just strange. This one is strange and sad, and the sadness is worth acknowledging. 28 years between joke and reality. Not all of the predictions are heavy. Not all of them carry the weight of politics or pandemics or tragedy. Some of them are simply wonderful in a way that feels like a gift. This is one of those. In 1996, The Simpsons aired an episode called Homer-Palooza, which follows Homer as he becomes involved with a touring rock music festival, modeled on the Lollapalooza festivals that dominated alternative music culture in the early 1990s. The episode is a love letter to a particular moment in American music, that era when alternative rock and hip-hop and an enormous variety of subcultural sounds were all being fed through the same festival pipeline and emerging with a strange, cacophonous, genuinely exciting energy. The episode features real musicians performing as themselves. Smashing Pumpkins, Peter Frampton, Cypress Hill. The musical cameos are handled with the affectionate irreverence the show always brought to celebrity appearances. The musicians are funny. They are self-aware. They are not playing dignified versions of themselves. And in one brief moment, in a background gag that the episode does not explain or return to, there is a listing on a concert schedule indicating that Cypress Hill has accidentally booked the London Symphony Orchestra for their tour. The joke is about the absurdity of backstage chaos, of booking mistakes and logistical confusion. Cypress Hill is a Los Angeles hip-hop group. The London Symphony Orchestra is one of the most prestigious classical music ensembles in the world. Their accidental joint booking is funny because of the distance between them, culturally, aesthetically, temperamentally. The image of a hip-hop group and a full orchestra sharing a stage is the joke, and it lands because of how impossible it seems. In February of 2024, at the Royal Albert Hall in London, Cypress Hill performed with the London Symphony Orchestra. 28 years. The show made the joke in 1996 and the reality arrived in 2024. And in between those two dates, the world changed completely. Technology transformed, music transformed, cultural boundaries that once seemed fixed became permeable and then porous, and then, in the end, entirely negotiable. The 2024 performance was not, as far as anyone knows, inspired by the Simpsons episode. The collaboration had its own logic and its own history. Cypress Hill had spent years performing with orchestral accompaniment at various points in their career. The Royal Albert Hall performance was a genuine artistic project, not a stunt. But when the announcement was made, the screenshots of the 1996 episode appeared instantly. The internet found the connection within hours, and the response was different from most of the other Simpsons prediction moments. With the Trump prediction, there was unease. With the pandemic episode, there was something close to dread. With the technology predictions, there was the slightly deflating recognition that smart people had simply done smart extrapolation. But Cypress Hill and the London Symphony produced delight, pure, uncomplicated delight, because this is a wonderful thing to have happen. The idea of a hip-hop group performing with a full classical orchestra is not just funny in the way the episode presented it. It is, in practice, genuinely beautiful. Hip-hop's relationship with orchestral music is long and complex, and often profoundly moving. The combination of the genre's rhythmic and lyrical power with the harmonic richness of a full orchestra has produced some of the most powerful music of the last 30 years. And The Simpsons, in 1996, made a joke about it, a throwaway background gag, a scheduling error written on a tour roster that appears on screen for perhaps 3 seconds. 28 years later, it happened. Not as a mistake, not as chaos, as an intentional artistic collaboration at one of the world's great concert venues. The prediction, if we're still calling it that, is the most optimistic one in the show's history. It doesn't predict disaster. It doesn't predict political upheaval or corporate consolidation or public health crisis. It predicts joy. A specific, wonderful kind of creative joy that emerges when things that don't seem like they should go together discover that they do. There is something worth sitting with in that for a moment. Most of the Simpsons predictions that get discussed are, when you look at them honestly, predictions of things going wrong. The Trump presidency as a satirical dystopia, the pandemic as a public health crisis, the corporate merger as a symbol of monopolistic consolidation, the tiger attack as the inevitable consequence of containing danger for entertainment. The predictions that get attention tend to be the dark ones, because dark things generate more anxiety, and anxiety drives more discussion. But Cypress Hill and the London Symphony is different. It's a prediction that life would find its way to something beautiful, that a collaboration that seemed absurd might turn out to be genuinely good, that the distance between things that seem incompatible is sometimes smaller than it looks, and the path between them sometimes shorter. The show made that prediction in 1996, in 3 seconds of background detail, and the world got around to making it true 28 years later. Of all the ways The Simpsons has been right about things, this might be the one most worth being right about. The concert, by all accounts, was extraordinary. The combination of Cypress Hill's particular intensity and the LSO's particular richness created something that neither could have produced alone. Music critics who attended described it as genuinely moving, the kind of event that reminds you why artistic risk-taking matters. The Simpsons didn't just predict the event, it predicted the emotional truth of it. The absurdity and the wonder happening simultaneously, neither canceling the other out, both being real at the same time. That is, in the end, what the best of The Simpsons has always been. Absurdity and wonder, happening simultaneously. Homer's cosmology and the shape of everything. Of all The Simpsons predictions, this is the most beautiful one to think about before sleep. Because it's about the shape of the universe. And it begins, naturally, with a donut. In 1999, The Simpsons aired an episode called Treehouse of Horror X, one of the show's annual Halloween special collections. In a segment within that episode, Homer Simpson encounters a cosmological puzzle, the question of what shape the universe actually is. And Homer proposes an answer. He suggests that the universe might be shaped like a donut. He uses the word torus, which is the mathematical term for a donut shape, a surface generated by revolving a circle in 3-dimensional space about an axis that is coplanar with the circle but does not intersect it. In simpler terms, a donut shape, a shape with a hole in the middle. This is played for comedy. Homer contemplating the geometry of the universe is funny because Homer contemplates donuts. His insight and his appetite have converged. The joke writes itself, and the episode moves on. But in 2003, a group of cosmologists published a paper in the journal Nature analyzing data from the WMAP satellite, which was measuring the cosmic microwave background radiation, the faint thermal echo of the Big Bang that permeates the entire universe. Their analysis suggested that the large-scale topology of the universe might be consistent with a torus shape. The universe, their data suggested, might be shaped like a donut. Homer was right, or at least Homer might be right. The cosmological question is not settled. The torus universe hypothesis remains an active area of research, neither confirmed nor ruled out. The 2003 paper generated significant discussion but was not, and is not, consensus. Modern cosmologists continue to analyze the geometry of the universe, and the question of its large-scale shape remains genuinely open. But the convergence between a 1999 cartoon joke and a 2003 scientific paper in Nature is striking in a way that resists simple explanation. The writers of that Treehouse of Horror segment were, once again, drawing on real physics. The torus as a possible universe topology was not invented by The Simpsons. It was a theoretical possibility that cosmologists had been considering for decades. The joke worked because it rhymed with real science. Not despite that rhyme, but because of it. Still, a cartoon from 1999 in which Homer Simpson proposes a donut-shaped universe, and a 2003 Nature paper suggesting the universe might actually have that topology. There is a quality to this one that the other predictions don't quite have. The others are about the human world, about politics and technology and entertainment and disease. They are predictions about things that humans do and build and suffer through. The donut universe prediction is about the shape of everything, about the fundamental geometry of reality itself. And it arrives in the form of Homer Simpson, the least likely cosmologist in the history of human thought, standing in front of a chalkboard making a joke that turned out to gesture, however obliquely, at something that might be true. There is also the mathematical dimension of this one that is worth sitting with. A torus is a mathematically beautiful object. Unlike a sphere, which is the naive assumption about the shape of the universe, a torus has a different kind of symmetry, a different set of properties, a different relationship between its interior and its surface. A universe with toroidal topology would have certain observable consequences. including patterns in the cosmic microwave background radiation that differ from what a spherical or flat topology would predict. The 2003 WMAP analysis was looking for exactly those kinds of patterns. They found something that was consistent with a toroidal topology, though not conclusively so. Subsequent analyses have been inconclusive. The question remains genuinely open. In a universe with toroidal topology, the large-scale structure would be one where light traveling far enough in one direction would eventually return to its starting point from the other side, the same way a traveler walking around the surface of a donut would eventually return to their starting point. It is a bounded universe, but it is bounded in a way that is topologically different from a sphere. It curves back on itself in a more complex fashion. Whether or not the universe is actually shaped this way, the suggestion is beautiful. The idea that the cosmos wraps back on itself, that there is an underlying symmetry to reality that echoes through its largest scales, has a kind of elegance that appeals across scientific and aesthetic contexts. Homer Simpson, reaching for the nearest round object in his mental furniture as a model for the universe, landed on that elegance by accident, or by the particular kind of insight that only arrives when you're not trying to be serious. There is a long history of important scientific ideas arriving obliquely, dressed as jokes or fantasies or naive observations. The structure of benzene was famously proposed after a dream about a snake eating its tail. The expanding universe was, initially, a prediction that Einstein himself resisted because it seemed too strange to accept. The most radical ideas in physics have often arrived wearing the disguise of something that could not possibly be right. Homer's donut universe is not, strictly speaking, in that tradition. The torus topology was not new when the Simpsons episode aired, but the episode placed it in front of millions of people, in a form that was memorable and accessible and surprisingly specific. It named the shape. It used the right word. It treated the possibility as something worth imagining. And 4 years later, a satellite measured the sky and found patterns that might be consistent with exactly that shape. Of all the things to fall asleep thinking about, this is among the most generous. The universe, possibly, curves back on itself in a great loop. Everything that travels far enough eventually returns to where it started. The shape of the cosmos, if Homer is right, is the shape of something warm and round and familiar, something that begins and returns, that has an inside and an outside, but whose inside and outside are ultimately the same thing viewed from different angles. There is something deeply comforting in that idea. The universe might be shaped like a donut. Homer thought so, and the evidence is not yet in. What Springfield still owes us. We have spent the last several hours going through the predictions that came true. The ones that started as jokes and ended as news stories. The ones that made people stop and stare and ask, how did they know? But there is another category that doesn't get discussed as much. The predictions that haven't come true yet. Because The Simpsons has been making predictions for 36 years, and not all of them have materialized. Some are vague enough that they might still be coming. Some are specific enough that we can track their status. And some are so strange that the only honest response is to say, we'll see. Let's go through some of them. The first, and in some ways the most interesting, is the prediction about a female president of the United States. Bart to the Future, the same episode that predicted the Trump presidency, depicted Lisa Simpson as the first female president of the United States. At the time of the episode's airing in 2000, the United States had never elected a female president. As of the present day, it still has not. This prediction is unusual because it represents both a success and an ongoing non-success simultaneously. The episode correctly identified that a Trump-style presidency would precede a historic first in American political history. But the specific historic first it imagined, a female president, has not yet arrived. Vice President Kamala Harris became the first woman to hold the vice presidency in January of 2021. Hillary Clinton was the first woman nominated for president by a major party in 2016. The trajectory toward a female president is visible and real. But the specific endpoint the show imagined in 2000 has not yet occurred. There is something worth sitting with in that. The show imagined the future of American politics with enough fidelity to correctly identify one of its most significant developments, but the other development it imagined has been delayed. Whether it arrives, and when, is not something anyone can know. But Springfield put it on the board. And Springfield's track record with political predictions, as we've established, is unusual enough to take seriously. The second prediction involves something more personal and less geopolitical. Across multiple episodes and multiple years, The Simpsons has depicted various technologies of healthcare that don't quite exist yet. Personalized medicine, treatments calibrated to individual genetic profiles, diagnostic tools that can identify illness from minimal information with extraordinary accuracy. The show has imagined a future of healthcare that is more precise, more individual, and more effective than what currently exists. The trajectory toward that future is real and visible. Genetic medicine, personalized oncology, AI-assisted diagnosis, these are not science fiction concepts. They are active areas of development with genuine recent progress. But the specific future the show has depicted, the one in which diagnosis and treatment are seamlessly integrated and highly individualized, remains ahead of us. Whether that future arrives in the form the show imagined, and on what timeline, is genuinely uncertain. But the show pointed at it early enough and specifically enough that its eventual arrival will almost certainly generate another wave of The Simpsons predicted it discussion. The third is the most speculative, and also perhaps the most interesting. Across multiple episodes, the show has depicted a future in which the distinction between physical and virtual experience has become less clear. Characters engage with simulated environments that feel real. Communication across distance has become so seamless that physical presence becomes optional in ways it currently is not. The boundaries between the mediated world and the immediate world have become genuinely permeable. This sounds like a description of the near future as imagined by the technology industry. Virtual reality, augmented reality, the metaverse in various forms. All of these represent attempts to do what The Simpsons has been casually depicting for years, to make the simulated world as experientially rich as the physical one. The attempts have, so far, not fully succeeded. Virtual reality is real and growing, but has not yet achieved the kind of seamless integration with ordinary life that the show has depicted. The metaverse, as actually developed, has been more limited and more awkward than the vision used to sell it. But the direction is clear. The trajectory is real, and the show has been pointing at the destination for long enough that its eventual arrival, in whatever form it takes, will once again feel like something Springfield predicted. The fourth category of not yet predictions is different from the others, because it involves not technology or politics but culture. The Simpsons, particularly in its earlier seasons, depicted a version of American cultural life in which the fractures and tensions that now feel acute were still latent, present beneath the surface, but not yet the defining feature of public life. The show anticipated, in various moments, and in various ways, the deepening of those fractures, the ways in which shared cultural reference points were gradually replaced by increasingly divided subcultural ones. It did this through Springfield itself. The show's town was always a community that struggled to agree on things, that formed and reformed factions, that discovered its own capacity for both connection and division. But the town, for all its quarrels, always functioned as a community. People disagreed and then arrived at something like consensus, or at least something like coexistence. Whether that version of community is still possible in the actual America that Springfield has always satirized is, at the moment, a genuinely open question. The show has depicted the tensions. It has not yet depicted their resolution, because the resolution has not arrived in the real world either. This is perhaps the most important prediction the show is still carrying. The question of whether a community as fractious and irrational and deeply imperfect as Springfield can hold itself together over time. Whether the collective amnesia that makes the town function is a pathology or, in some strange way, a survival mechanism. Whether the capacity to forget catastrophe and start fresh is something worth preserving or something that prevents genuine growth. The show has been asking that question for 36 years without answering it. The real world has been asking it for at least as long. And the answer, when it comes, may well arrive in Springfield first. Before we close this section, let's spend a moment on the most whimsical category of unfulfilled predictions. The Simpsons, across its history, has depicted various pieces of technology that have not arrived. Jetpacks that work properly and are widely available. Flying cars that are practical and common. Food preparation technology that is significantly beyond current capabilities. Physical health interventions that are dramatically more effective than what we currently have access to. These are the predictions that miss rather than hit. The futures that seemed plausible when they were imagined and haven't yet materialized. They are useful to name, because they provide context for the hits. The show made predictions at a very high volume, and volume means some will be wrong as well as some being right. The jetpack, in particular, is a useful corrective to too much amazement at the accurate predictions. The jetpack has been 10 years away for approximately 70 years. The Simpsons predicted flying cars that are still not here. These are the darts that miss the bullseye, or that haven't found their target yet. We don't share screenshots of the jetpack predictions. We don't write articles about them. They sit in the archive, quietly wrong, reminding us that the show was not prophetic in any magical sense. It was just industrious and smart, and running long enough that some of its guesses would inevitably hit. The flying cars of Springfield remain in Springfield. They have not yet arrived in the real world. We are still waiting, and somewhere in the writer's room of a show that has been running since 1989, someone is probably writing a new prediction right now, for an event or a technology or a cultural moment that won't materialize for another decade or two. We won't know which one it is until it lands. That's the thing about predictions. You only recognize them in retrospect. The real explanation behind the phenomenon. We've been in Springfield for several hours now. We've gone through the predictions one by one. The Trump escalator, and the pandemic episode, and the smartwatch, and the Disney merger, and Homer going to space, and the Higgs boson equation, and the tiger attack, and the Cypress Hill concert, and the donut universe. We've looked at the ones that haven't happened yet. We've sat with the ones that were dark, and the ones that were wonderful, and the ones that were simply, strangely specific. And now it's time to ask the question that ties all of it together. Not just how did they know, because we've been addressing that as we've gone, but why does the question matter so much to us? Why do we keep returning to it? Why, every time another Simpsons prediction appears to come true, does the internet respond with the same mixture of amazement and something that feels, if you're honest about it, almost like relief? Let's start with the straightforward explanation, because it is largely correct and it deserves to be stated clearly. The Simpsons has been producing satirical content about American culture since 1989. That's 36 years of episodes, hundreds of writers, thousands of jokes, tens of thousands of satirical observations. When you produce that volume of content, when you observe and extrapolate and satirize at that scale and for that long, some percentage of what you produce will, through statistical inevitability, turn out to describe things that haven't happened yet. This is not remarkable in a supernatural sense. It is remarkable in a human sense. It reflects the dedication and intelligence and discipline of a writing staff that has maintained, across decades and changing personnel, an extraordinarily high standard of observation and execution. The predictions are a byproduct of excellence. They are what happens when smart, careful people watch the world closely for a very long time and write down what they see. That explanation covers most of it. Probably 90% of the documented predictions are adequately explained by volume, talent, and the tendency of confirmed bias to amplify the hits and suppress the misses. But there is a second layer, and it's worth taking seriously. The Simpsons is not just a show that observes American culture. It is a show that has become part of American culture in a way that changes the culture it observes. It has been running long enough, and has been watched widely enough, and has infiltrated the shared language of American life deeply enough that it has ceased to be purely descriptive and has become, in certain ways, generative. Let's think about the Trump prediction again, with this in mind. The episode from 2000 depicted Trump as a logical endpoint of celebrity politics. Millions of people saw it. The image of a Trump presidency was seeded into the cultural imagination with a particular framing: absurd, inevitable, the obvious next step in a direction America was already heading. When Trump began his campaign in earnest in 2015, the show's audience, which included much of the media class that covered the campaign, already had a mental image of what it would look like. The Simpsons had given them one. Did that make the Trump presidency more likely? Almost certainly not in any direct causal sense. The factors that produced the 2016 election result were far too large and complex to be materially affected by a joke in a 2000 cartoon. But the show may have made the possibility feel more legible, more familiar, more like something that fitted a known pattern rather than something unprecedented and shocking. The joke didn't predict the future. It prepared the audience for a particular kind of future. And when that future arrived, the audience recognized it partly because they'd already been shown what it might look like. This is how cultural influence actually works. Not through prophecy or magic or mysterious knowledge, through familiarity, through the gradual, patient accumulation of images and framings and narratives that shape how people understand what they see. The Simpsons has been doing that for 36 years. It has been placing images in the cultural imagination for so long that some of those images have become the frames through which Americans understand their own experience. When something happens in America that rhymes with something from the show, the recognition is not just intellectual, it is visceral. Oh, this is a Simpsons thing. This is the kind of thing that happens in Springfield. And Springfield, as we've established, is America. There is a third layer, and this one is perhaps the most interesting to sit with as you drift off towards sleep. The show has been right about things not because its writers could see the future, but because the future is, in important ways, continuous with the present. The trajectories that lead from where we are to where we're going are not hidden. They are visible to anyone paying careful enough attention. What looks like prediction from the outside is usually observation from the inside, the observation of someone who has looked at a trend clearly enough to follow it forward. The writers of The Simpsons were, at their peak, among the most careful observers of American life that television has ever gathered in one place. They looked at technology and saw where it was heading. They looked at corporate culture and saw where it was heading. They looked at celebrity and politics and media and public health and saw where each of those things was heading, and they wrote it down, in the form of jokes, with enough specificity that when the destinations arrived, the directions they'd pointed were recognizable. That is not a small thing. That is, actually, a kind of genius. The genius of the very good observer, the person who watches carefully enough and thinks clearly enough and writes honestly enough that their work outlasts the moment it was written for and finds new meanings in new times. Most art doesn't do that. Most art is so thoroughly of its moment that it becomes opaque as the moment passes. The Simpsons, at its best, was writing things that were going to be true again in 10 years and 20 years and 30 years, not because it was predicting the future, but because it was describing structures and patterns and dynamics that are persistent features of American life. Burns's monopoly over Springfield is a persistent feature of American economic life. The way concentrated wealth uses its position to maintain and extend its position. Homer's confused struggle to make meaning of work that doesn't see him as a person is a persistent feature of American working life. Marge's invisible labor that holds the family together without being acknowledged is a persistent feature of American domestic life. These are not predictions. These are diagnoses. And diagnoses that are accurate remain accurate across time. When the specific details the show attach to those diagnoses, the Trump presidency, the pandemic, the corporate merger, the scientific discovery, when those details arrived in the real world, they arrived already wearing the shape the show had given them. They didn't look new. They looked like the next episode of something that had been running for 36 years. That's not prophecy, that's continuity. The continuity of certain deep patterns in American life that The Simpsons identified early enough and articulated clearly enough that we've been living inside its vocabulary for decades. And that, finally, is the most honest answer to the question of how they knew. They knew because they were paying attention. They were paying attention in 1989, and they kept paying attention through every season, every change in the writing staff, every shift in the cultural landscape. They looked at America and they wrote down what they saw, and they pushed it forward and they kept writing. 788 episodes, 36 years. Thousands of observations about the place we live and the people we are and the direction we seem to be heading. Some of those observations will turn out to be right. Some already have been. Some are still waiting for reality to arrive. And some will never come true because they were reaching in a direction the world didn't end up going. The ones that came true are the ones we remember, because memory is shaped by pattern, and prediction is a particularly satisfying kind of pattern. We find them remarkable because they are remarkable, even if their remarkability is the remarkability of careful attention over time, rather than anything supernatural. The show paid attention to America for 36 years. America rewarded that attention by occasionally becoming what the show had described. That is, in the end, the only mystery. Not how they predicted things, but why we needed them to predict things in the first place. Why the comfort of recognition, the sense that someone saw this coming, that the present was always already legible to those paying close enough attention. Why that comfort matters so much to us. Perhaps because the future feels less frightening when someone has already been there. Even if someone is a cartoon with yellow skin and 4 fingers. Even if there is Homer Simpson, navigating a world that keeps accelerating away from him, making every mistake in every direction, and finding his way home by the end of the episode regardless. That is the great prediction of The Simpsons. not any specific event or technology or political development. The great prediction is that whatever happens, however strange and how fast, the family will still be on the couch at the end of the night, the door will still be unlocked on Evergreen Terrace, and Springfield will still be there when you come back. That prediction has been right every week for 36 years. It may be the most remarkable one of all. And now, as we come to the end of tonight, as Springfield fades gently into the comfortable dark behind your eyes, let that last prediction carry you. Whatever the world is becoming, however fast it's moving, however strange the news gets in the morning, the same family will be there in the evening, on the same couch, in the same impossible town. The show that has been right about so much is still running, still paying attention, still finding jokes in the distance between what we are and what we think we are, still watching America, still getting it right, and somewhere in the background, written on a chalkboard in 3 seconds of a joke about donuts, there is probably a prediction that hasn't come true yet, something that seems absurd right now, something that will seem obvious in 15 years. We'll be watching. Springfield will be there when you wake up. It always is. That's the whole point. To fully appreciate the Trump prediction, we need to understand something about the America that existed in the late 1990s and the year 2000, because that context is what made the joke legible to the writers in the first place. The late 1990s were a period of unusual prosperity and unusual anxiety in roughly equal measure. The economy was booming. The technology sector was generating enormous wealth, at a pace that felt almost hallucinatory to people who had grown up with the slower rhythms of traditional industry. Unemployment was low. The budget was, briefly and unusually, in surplus. The United States had emerged from the Cold War as the unambiguous dominant power in the world, and the foreign policy debates of the decade were about what to do with that dominance, rather than about managing an existential threat. And yet underneath that prosperity, there was a deep unease. The wealth was not equally distributed. The boom was concentrated in ways that felt, to people in the middle of the country and in the working class, like something happening somewhere else for someone else. The celebrity culture that had been building since the 1980s had reached a kind of critical mass, a point where fame and wealth had begun to function as alternative forms of authority, substitutes for the institutional credibility that traditional political figures were slowly losing. Bill Clinton had survived an impeachment trial by the skin of his popularity, which was based almost entirely on personal charisma and political skill rather than any particular institutional respect. The impeachment itself had demonstrated, to careful observers, that the institutional frameworks of American political life were more fragile than they had appeared. They depended on norms of behavior and shared agreement about what was acceptable, and those norms were beginning to show stress fractures. The Simpsons writers looking at this landscape in early 2000 were not naive. They saw the stress fractures. They understood that celebrity culture and political culture were converging in ways that had implications. They had been watching Trump for 15 years at that point, watching him maintain his visibility through serial self-promotion that had no real equivalent in previous American public life. Their joke about Trump becoming president was a diagnosis of all of that, compressed into a throwaway line and a title card. It said, "This is where the convergence of celebrity and politics leads. This is the logical endpoint of norms eroding and fame substituting for authority and money becoming its own form of qualification. Here is a name. Here is a face. This is what it looks like when the trajectory you are on reaches its destination." The joke was right about the destination. The trajectory took longer to get there than the writers probably expected, but the endpoint they identified was the right one. Understanding that the prediction was structural rather than specific is what makes it genuinely impressive. The writers were not guessing that Trump, specifically, would run and win in a specific election year. They were identifying a pattern of American cultural development and pointing at its endpoint. The fact that the endpoint was named Trump, and that it arrived in 2016 rather than 2004 or 2024, is the specific coincidence. The underlying diagnosis was accurate regardless of the timing or the specific name attached to it. That is the difference between a lucky guess and a genuine insight. A lucky guess is right about the details. A genuine insight is right about the structure. The Trump prediction was right about both, and that is what makes it the most frequently discussed and the most enduringly striking prediction in the show's history. There is one more dimension worth exploring here, and it has to do with the character of Lisa Simpson herself. The Bart to the Future episode placed Lisa in the White House not as a coincidence but as a deliberate counterpoint to Trump. Lisa represents a certain kind of American aspiration, the idea that serious, principled, intellectually rigorous leadership is the antidote to the kind of celebrity-driven excess the show was satirizing through Trump. She is the opposite of everything the show was criticizing in the previous president. She is prepared, thoughtful, policy-oriented, uncomfortable with the theater of power. The episode was making an argument as much as it was making a prediction. The argument was, celebrity politics produces a certain kind of chaos, and the recovery from that chaos requires the opposite of celebrity politics. It requires someone like Lisa, someone who finds the theater of power uncomfortable, someone who would rather do the work than perform doing the work. Whether the real world's recovery from the Trump presidency followed that arc is a more complicated question. But the show's argument about the dynamic, about what celebrity politics produces and what its antidote looks like, was structurally accurate. Lisa was always the show's moral compass. Placing her as the inheritor of Trump's presidential chaos was not just a joke. It was a statement about what the show valued and what it thought America needed. Whether America agreed is a different question. But the statement was made, clearly, in 2000, and it has not lost its relevance in the years since. The Marge and Chains episode does something that becomes even more interesting when you think about it in the context of the COVID pandemic. It does not just depict the arrival and spread of a novel illness. It depicts the aftermath, the way a community processes a shared traumatic experience and returns to something like normal. In Springfield, the return to normal happens very quickly. The flu passes, the town recovers, and within a remarkably short time, life goes on as if nothing particularly significant had occurred. The illness is mentioned a few times in subsequent references within the episode, but quickly becomes backstory, part of the texture of life in Springfield rather than a defining event that the community dwells on or learns from. This is, in a way, the most accurate part of the prediction. The COVID pandemic, as the world moved through it and beyond its most acute phase, generated an enormous amount of discussion about collective memory and collective processing. There were arguments about whether the pandemic would be remembered and discuss the way that other major historical traumas have been remembered, whether it would generate a sustained cultural reckoning with the failures of public health infrastructure and political response that had allowed it to be so devastating. The evidence, as of now, suggests that the collective processing has been incomplete, fragmented, and in many cases, actively avoided. Communities wanted to move on. Institutions wanted to move on. The desire to declare the pandemic over, to return to something like the pre-pandemic normal, was powerful enough to shape policy decisions and public discourse in ways that sometimes felt premature. Springfield had that impulse in 1993. The town just wanted to get back to normal. The flu was unpleasant. Its lessons were uncomfortable. The most comfortable response was to absorb it and move on without dwelling too much on what it had revealed about the town's vulnerabilities. That is a remarkably precise description of how many communities handled the COVID pandemic. The desire to simply be done with it, to not integrate the experience into a lasting change in how public health is managed or how community resilience is maintained, turned out to be very powerful. The Simpsons depicted that impulse in 1993 in the context of a comedic flu storyline, and it played out again in the context of a global pandemic with deadly consequences. The prediction is not just about the illness. It is about the forgetting that follows the illness. And that might be the more important, and the more uncomfortable, accuracy. There is also something worth noting about Marge herself in this episode, because the flu storyline and the shoplifting storyline intersect in a way that illuminates something true about how crises tend to fall on certain members of a community more heavily than others. Marge is exhausted at the beginning of the episode. She is exhausted because she is doing everything. She is managing the household, taking care of the children, shopping for the family's food and medication, trying to keep everything running during the disruption of the flu. And in that state of exhaustion, she makes a mistake. She forgets to pay for an item at the Quick E-Mart. She is arrested. She is tried. She is imprisoned briefly. The person who bore the heaviest burden of managing the household through the community's illness crisis is the person who is punished most severely when the crisis causes her to slip up. She is not punished by the flu. She is punished by the community's legal system for a failure that was a direct consequence of the flu's demands on her capacity. That is not a simple observation. It is a structural observation about how crises distribute their weight unevenly, about how the people who do the most invisible work during emergencies are often the most exposed to consequences when the accumulated stress of that work leads to failure. The COVID pandemic generated an enormous amount of discourse about exactly this dynamic. The people who kept essential services running, who managed households through lockdowns, who balanced caregiving with work and work with caregiving, were disproportionately women, disproportionately working class, disproportionately people whose labor had been consistently undervalued before the crisis revealed how essential it was. The Simpsons, in 1993, put Marge at the center of a flu epidemic storyline and showed exactly that dynamic. She carries the load. She makes a mistake under the weight of the load. She is punished for the mistake. The show does not frame it as a structural observation. It frames it as a story about Marge's quiet dignity and the community's eventual recognition of how much she means to them. But the structure is there, visible in retrospect, accurate in ways the writers may not have entirely intended. That accidental accuracy, the prediction that emerges not from deliberate extrapolation but from honest storytelling about real human dynamics, is in some ways the most interesting kind. It suggests that the show was not just predicting futures. It was, in its best moments, describing truths that transcend any particular historical moment and keep finding new expressions as history continues. The flu will always fall hardest on the people who can least afford to stop. The community will always want to forget what the crisis revealed about its own vulnerabilities. The person who kept everything running will always risk being punished for the slip that the keeping everything running made inevitable. The Simpsons knew that in 1993. We lived it again in 2020. To understand how The Simpsons managed to make technologically accurate predictions, it helps to understand something about the specific people who were writing the show during its most celebrated period. The Simpsons writing staff of the early to mid-1990s was, by the standards of television comedy, an extraordinary collection of people. This was not accidental. The show attracted writers of unusual intellectual depth for several reasons. The creative freedom it offered was unusual. The cultural prestige it was rapidly accumulating made it a destination for talented people who might otherwise have pursued academic or literary careers. And Matt Groening and James L. Brooks, the show's original creative architects, had established a tone and standard that drew in exactly the kind of people who would maintain and elevate it. The Harvard connection is well documented and frequently discussed. A remarkable number of the show's writers during this period were Harvard graduates, many of whom had worked on the Harvard Lampoon, the university's humor magazine. The Lampoon has historically been one of the most effective pipelines from elite academic training to comedy writing, and The Simpsons benefited from that pipeline more than perhaps any other show in television history. But the Harvard connection alone does not explain the show's scientific literacy. Several of the writers had backgrounds that went significantly deeper into mathematics and science than a standard humanities education. Conan O'Brien, who wrote for the show before going on to host late-night television, had a history degree from Harvard but was surrounded by writers who had studied physics, mathematics, and computer science. David X. Cohen, whose Higgs boson equation we discussed earlier, had physics and computer science degrees. Al Jean, who has been running the show for decades, had a mathematics degree from Harvard. The show created an environment in which people with genuine scientific training were writing jokes alongside people with literary and humanistic training, and the combination produced something that neither group could have produced independently. The scientific writers brought accuracy and rigor. The humanistic writers brought narrative instinct and emotional intelligence. The intersection, when it worked, produced comedy that was both technically specific and deeply felt. The technology predictions are the clearest evidence of what that intersection produced. When the show imagined video calls or smartwatches or on-demand information access, it was not simply borrowing familiar science fiction images. It was applying genuine understanding of technological trajectories to the craft of comic prediction. The writers knew, in some cases in considerable technical detail, what the directions of computing and communications technology implied for daily life in 15 or 20 years. That knowledge was not common in 1995. The general public's understanding of where technology was going was considerably more vague and more optimistic and less specific than the understanding of someone who had spent years studying computer science at an elite university. The writers of The Simpsons had access to better models of the technological future than most people around them, and those better models produced better predictions. This is a more honest version of the prediction story than the mystical version. It is also, in its own way, more impressive. The show was not supernaturally lucky. It was staffed by people who were, in specific and relevant ways, significantly better informed about the directions of technology and culture than the average observer. Those better informed people used their advantages to write jokes that happened to be accurate. That is not prophecy. That is expertise applied at volume over time. And the results, from the outside, can look quite a lot like prophecy. There is one more dimension to the technology predictions worth exploring before we move on. The show's accuracy about technology was not uniform. The writers were better at predicting the directions of information technology, communication technology, and the social implications of those technologies than they were at predicting the directions of, say, energy technology or transportation technology. The predictions cluster in areas where the writers had relevant expertise and where the trajectories were visible to informed observers. This clustering is itself revealing. It suggests that the predictions were not random. They were produced by specific knowledge applied in specific domains. The writers who understood computing and communication predicted the future of computing and communication accurately. The show as a whole, because it had multiple writers with different backgrounds, made predictions across multiple domains with varying degrees of accuracy. The smartwatch was predicted accurately because David X. Cohen understood computing trajectories. The Disney-Fox merger was predicted accurately because writers who read the business press understood media consolidation. The pandemic episode was accurate about flu dynamics because writers who read public health literature understood epidemic patterns. In each case, the accuracy was domain-specific and expertise-dependent. That is what good prediction looks like. Not uniform omniscience, but specific insight applied in the right places by the right people. The show assembled enough of those right people, writing in enough domains, over a long enough period, that the predictions accumulated into something that looked, from the outside, like a general gift for foresight. It was not a gift. It was labor. Careful, intelligent, sustained labor applied to the task of understanding the world and describing it honestly. The technology predictions are the clearest evidence of that. They show us a show that was working harder and thinking more carefully than it looked, producing comedy that had more substance beneath it than a casual viewer would ever suspect. That is The Simpsons in its best form. The Disney-Fox merger prediction is most commonly discussed as a single, specific forecast, and it is a remarkable one. But to understand its full significance, it helps to situate it within the broader context of what the show was saying about media consolidation during this period. The Simpsons had, from very early in its run, been interested in the relationship between media ownership and the information environment that ordinary people inhabit. Burns owned everything in Springfield that mattered economically, including the newspaper at various points, and the show consistently depicted the connection between economic power and narrative power. Whoever controlled the infrastructure of information in Springfield could shape how Springfield understood itself. The Disney joke in the background of "When You Dish Upon a Star" was part of a larger ongoing observation the show was making about media concentration. By 1998, Disney was already the clearest example of what fully realized media consolidation looked like. It owned the stories that children grew up with. It owned the physical spaces where families went to celebrate. It owned the television channels that delivered its properties into living rooms. It owned the merchandise pipelines that extended its intellectual properties into every corner of daily life. The joke about Disney absorbing Fox was not just a joke about corporate size. It was a joke about narrative control, about what it means when one entity owns enough of the stories a culture tells about itself to shape how that culture understands what it is and what it values. That observation has become considerably more pointed in the years since the merger actually happened. Disney's acquisition of Fox, combined with its earlier acquisitions of Pixar, Marvel, and Lucasfilm, created a company with a remarkable concentration of the intellectual properties that define popular culture in the English-speaking world and much of the rest of the world. The company owns in various ways a significant portion of the mythological infrastructure of contemporary entertainment. The Simpsons predicted the specific corporate event, but what it was really pointing at was the direction of cultural power. The way that concentrated corporate ownership of entertainment properties translates into a particular kind of influence over how people imagine themselves and their world. That broader prediction, the one about the direction of cultural power, has proven to be accurate in ways that go well beyond the specific Disney-Fox transaction. The streaming era has, in some respects, accelerated the dynamics the show was observing in 1998. A smaller number of larger platforms now mediate the entertainment experiences of a larger proportion of the global population than ever before. The concentration has, if anything, intensified. The Simpsons saw this coming in the background of a plot about Homer meeting celebrities. That background detail turned out to be the most significant thing in the episode. That is, repeatedly, the pattern with the show's best observations. The things that matter most are in the margins, the throwaway details, the background gags that you have to look closely to see. The main plots are usually about human relationships and emotional dynamics, the kinds of stories that connect with audiences across time and culture. But the background details, the environmental texture of Springfield, carry the show's most precise and most prescient observations about the direction of American life. The Disney subtitle under the Fox logo was background. It was furniture. It was the kind of thing a viewer might not even register consciously on first watch. But it contained more genuine insight into the direction of corporate entertainment than most of the entertainment media coverage produced in that same year. That is The Simpsons at its most Simpsons. The Deep Space Homer episode raises a question that is worth dwelling on because it connects to something important about why space exploration has mattered to human beings and continues to matter. The NASA officials in the episode are worried about declining public engagement with space. Their solution, sending an ordinary person to space, is based on an assumption about what generates wonder. Their assumption is that wonder requires novelty, and that novelty requires fresh eyes. The astronauts who have been going to space for decades have become, in the public's perception, professionals doing a professional job. Impressive, certainly, but no longer astonishing. The wonder of the thing has been normalized away by repetition and familiarity. Homer's fresh eyes restore the wonder because they are genuinely fresh. When Homer looks out the window of the shuttle at the Earth below, he is not performing astonishment. He is experiencing it. His wonder is unmediated and therefore legible to anyone watching. The audience can feel what he feels because what he feels is what they would feel. That insight, about the relationship between familiarity and wonder, and the way fresh eyes can restore what expertise has rendered invisible, is one of the most interesting things the episode has to say. And it connects directly to the commercial space tourism industry that the episode was in some sense anticipating. The most successful moments of commercial space tourism in the 2020s have been precisely those moments when someone who had never expected to leave the Earth found themselves floating above it. The photographs from those missions, the ones that circulated most widely, the ones that generated the most emotional response, tended to be the ones in which an ordinary person, someone not trained to suppress emotion in professional contexts, was visibly overwhelmed by what they were experiencing. Those moments restored wonder, not to the people experiencing them, necessarily, who were presumably already convinced that space was worth going to, but to the people watching. The audience for commercial space tourism, looking at those images, experienced a version of what the NASA officials in the Deep Space Homer episode wanted to recreate. The ordinary person's astonishment, unguarded and unperformed, made the extraordinary visible again. The Simpsons identified that dynamic in 1994. The commercial space tourism industry spent several $billion arriving at the same insight in the 2020s. There is something to be said for being early. Buzz Aldrin's presence in the episode adds another dimension to this philosophical point. Aldrin is the professional, the person for whom space travel has been the central fact of his life for decades. His wonder, presumably, is not gone, but it has been transformed by experience into something deeper and quieter than the astonishment of the first exposure. By appearing in the episode alongside Homer, by treating Homer's amateur enthusiasm as something worth celebrating rather than something to be patronized, Aldrin was performing a kind of generosity that the episode understood as essential to the whole enterprise. The person who has done the extraordinary thing saying to the person who wants to do a smaller version of it, "Yes, you should. It is worth it." The wonder is real. I know because I felt it too. That exchange, the experienced person honoring the aspiration of the inexperienced one, is what kept public interest in space exploration alive through the decades of the show's run. And it is what the commercial space tourism companies understood, perhaps better than they understood anything else, when they began designing their experiences. The product they were selling was not access to space, it was access to wonder. And Buzz Aldrin, appearing on The Simpsons in 1994 to encourage Homer Simpson, was selling exactly the same thing. The Higgs boson equation is unusual among The Simpsons' predictions because it exists not just as a coincidence between the show and a subsequent real-world event, but as a direct expression of genuine scientific knowledge embedded in a comedic context. There is a tradition in American comedy of treating science with either reverential distance, it is too complicated for jokes, or dismissive condescension, it is just stuff that nerds care about. The Simpsons, at its peak, did neither. It treated science the way a scientifically literate writer would treat any other domain of human knowledge, as interesting, as relevant, as providing material for jokes, precisely because jokes require genuine understanding of their subject matter. The chalkboard in Homer's basement workshop is covered with equations that were written by people who understood what they were writing. The Higgs boson equation is the most famous example, but it is not the only one. Throughout the show's history, mathematical and scientific references appear in contexts that require genuine knowledge to construct, let alone to find funny. The show's relationship with mathematics in particular is worth examining. Multiple episodes include real mathematical content, sometimes quite advanced content, deployed as jokes. A proof that is actually a proof. An equation that actually calculates something. A reference to a mathematical theorem that is genuinely a theorem. These are not decorative gestures towards scientific credibility. They are actual mathematics, placed in comedic context by people who understood the mathematics well enough to choose it for comic effect. That level of engagement with real scientific content is almost without parallel in the history of broadcast television. Most shows that deal with science treat it as set dressing, as visual shorthand for intelligence, as the backdrop against which human drama occurs. The Simpsons, during its best period, treated it as something more, as subject matter, as a domain of genuine human achievement that was funny and interesting and worth the effort of understanding. The result was a show that produced something like the Higgs boson equation, a real calculation in a comedy about a man who wants to be Thomas Edison, sitting in the background of a joke that will land perfectly well whether or not you know what the equation means, but that gains an entirely different quality if you do. That is what genuine scientific literacy in comedy looks like. It is not about making science the point of the joke. It is about using real science as material for jokes that work on multiple levels, that are funny without the context but illuminated by it. The Higgs boson equation works as a visual gag about Homer's intellectual pretensions, whether or not you know any particle physics. But if you do know particle physics, it works differently. It adds a layer of recognition, a sense that the show was engaged with the real thing rather than an approximation of it. That layered quality is what made The Simpsons, at its best, unusual. And the Higgs boson equation is the most extreme example of that quality in the show's entire history. Homerpalooza is not the only Simpsons episode that has proven prescient about music, but it is the most dramatically vindicated one. The show has always had a complicated relationship with music. The Simpsons theme itself, written by Danny Elfman, is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in television history. The show has used music throughout its run as a sophisticated storytelling tool, deploying everything from operatic grandeur to punk abrasion to hip-hop rhythms to serve its emotional and comedic purposes. The musical cameos across the show's history are extraordinary in their range. Johnny Cash appeared as the voice of a coyote in a Spiritual Journey episode. Beck appeared performing an original song. Linda Ronstadt appeared performing at Homer's Barbershop Quartet. The list goes on for pages, spanning genres and generations and styles. What is interesting about this range is that the show was not just booking celebrities for the recognition value. The musical guests were usually chosen because they fit a specific emotional or thematic purpose in the episode they appeared in. The music was part of the storytelling, not decoration hung on it. The Cypress Hill episode is the most extreme expression of this tendency. The joke about the accidental booking of the London Symphony Orchestra is funny precisely because both Cypress Hill and the LSO are depicted as genuine musical entities with specific sounds and specific cultural associations, not as generic celebrity placeholders. The humor requires you to understand something about both, to feel the distance between them as musically and culturally real. 28 years later, the distance turned out to be traversable. The artists themselves made the journey, choosing to close the gap the show had joked about, and the result was, by all accounts, musically substantial. There is something worth thinking about in that. The Simpsons joke worked because the gap was real. The real collaboration worked because the gap, while real, was not absolute. The joke acknowledged the distance. The artist decided to bridge it. That is a version of what the best satire always does. It points at the absurdity of something, but in doing so, it reveals the possibility that the absurdity is not the final word. The distance between Cypress Hill and the London Symphony Orchestra was, in 1996, the distance between two cultural worlds that seemed to have no reason to meet. But culture is not static. Cultural distances that seem absolute in one decade have a way of becoming negotiable in the next. The Simpsons saw the gap. The artists eventually saw the bridge. There is one more thing worth saying about this particular prediction before we leave it. The Cypress Hill LSO collaboration is, in the taxonomy of Simpsons predictions, the only one that is unambiguously good news. Every other major prediction on our list is either neutral, an interesting coincidence like the Higgs boson equation, or dark. The Trump presidency, the pandemic, the Tiger attack, the corporate merger. The predictions that have generated the most discussion tend to be the ones that point at things going wrong. The Cypress Hill prediction is different. It points at something going right, at cultural creativity finding an unexpected expression, at artists choosing to make something beautiful out of a premise that started as a joke. That is worth celebrating, in a quiet way, as we drift toward the end of tonight. The show has been right about many things. Some of those things were worth being right about, some were not. But this particular piece of musical absurdity that turned into genuine art 28 years later, is worth being right about. The world is richer for the Cypress Hill LSO collaboration existing. And The Simpsons, in 1996, made a joke that pointed at the possibility of that collaboration existing, a possibility that the actual world eventually chose to realize. That is not prophecy, but it is something. The Donut Universe prediction has a quality that the other predictions do not quite share, and it is worth trying to articulate precisely what that quality is. Most of The Simpsons predictions are about human affairs, about politics, technology, corporate behavior, entertainment, medicine. They are about what human beings do, how human institutions evolve, where human choices lead. They are predictions about the human world. The Donut Universe is a prediction about something that exists independently of human beings entirely. The shape of the universe is not determined by politics or technology or corporate strategy. It is a feature of physical reality that predates human existence by billions of years and will persist long after human beings have ceased to exist. Whatever the universe's shape is, it is what it was before life arrived and what it will be after life departs. Homer's Taurus prediction, however accidental, reached past the human world into something permanent. It touched, however glancingly, the deep structure of physical reality, and that gives it a different quality from the other predictions. Most of the predictions, when they come true, generate feelings of recognition and sometimes unease. The world is like Springfield. The direction we are heading is the direction the show described. These are interesting feelings, but they are essentially feelings about the human situation, about politics and culture and the organization of social life. The Donut Universe, if it turns out to be right, generates something different. Not recognition of a human pattern, but recognition of a cosmic fact. The universe has always been shaped this way. The Taurus topology, if it is real, has been real since the Big Bang. Homer's joke from 1999 was pointing at something that has existed for approximately 14 billion years. There is something quietly vertiginous about that. The idea that a cartoon from 1999 gestured, however obliquely, at the shape of everything, that a joke about donuts touched, by accident or by careful scientific calculation or by some combination of both, the actual geometry of the cosmos. We do not know if the universe is shaped like a torus. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive. The question remains open, and it may remain open for a long time, because measuring the large-scale topology of the universe requires data that is difficult to obtain and difficult to interpret. But the question is open in a way that includes Homer's answer as a genuine possibility. The universe might be shaped like a donut. Homer thought so. And the satellite data came back with patterns that are consistent with his hypothesis. That is enough to sit with as you drift toward sleep. The universe might be shaped like a donut. Everything that travels far enough eventually comes home. The cosmos curves back on itself in a great, comfortable loop. Nothing is lost. Nothing disappears forever. Everything returns. Whether or not that is true of the universe's geometry, it is true of The Simpsons. The family always returns to the couch. Springfield always returns to normal. The show always comes back around to the same themes, the same characters, the same impossible town where time does not pass and nothing is ever finally lost. Homer's Donut Universe is not just a cosmological prediction. It is a description of the show itself. A loop that never ends. A shape that keeps returning to where it started. The universe might be shaped like a donut. The Simpsons definitely is. And on that note, as Springfield fades slowly into the comfortable dark, let us rest in the knowledge that wherever we are in the loop tonight, the beginning is not far away. The couch is waiting on Evergreen Terrace. The family is there. And Homer, somewhere between genius and absurdity, is probably eating a donut and being right about something. As we near the end of tonight's journey through Springfield, let us pause for a moment in the quiet between predictions and just let the town exist around us. Springfield is a remarkable invention. It is everywhere and nowhere. It is every American town and no American town. It has been home to the same impossible family for 36 years, and in that time, it has served as a kind of seismograph for the tremors of American culture, recording the patterns that ordinary observation tends to miss. The predictions we have discussed tonight are the most dramatic expressions of what that seismograph has recorded, but they are not the only ones. Every episode of The Simpsons contains observations about the world it was made in, and many of those observations have proven to be more durable and more accurate than the moment of their creation would have suggested. There is the observation about the relationship between concentrated economic power and political power, about how a town that depends on a single employer for its economic survival cannot effectively hold that employer accountable, about how the rules that govern ordinary people bend and flex around those who have enough money to resist their application. That observation, made comedically through Burns and Springfield, has been validated repeatedly in the decades since the show began. There is the observation about the relationship between media and democracy, about how the channels through which information flows shape what people believe is possible, what they accept as normal, what they find unacceptable, about how the owners of those channels have interests that are not always aligned with the interests of the people who consume their products. That observation, made through the show's depictions of Kent Brockman and the Springfield media ecosystem, is more relevant now than it was in 1989. There is the observation about the relationship between nostalgia and politics, about how communities in stress reach backward toward an imagined past, toward a simpler time that may not have existed in quite the form it is remembered, and about how that reaching backward can prevent the adaptation that the present moment requires. Springfield is a town that is always trying to be what it was, and the show has always understood that this tendency, while human and understandable, is also a kind of trap. These are not predictions in the headline sense. They are not things that will generate a screenshot comparison between a 1995 Simpsons frame and a 2023 news photograph. They are too structural for that, too embedded in the fabric of the show rather than expressed in a single quotable moment. But they are accurate, and in some ways, they are more important than the dramatic predictions we have been discussing, because they describe dynamics that are ongoing and persistent rather than events that arrive and pass. The Simpsons has been right about these things for 36 years. It is likely to continue being right about them for as long as the underlying dynamics persist, which may be for quite some time. As you drift off tonight, as Springfield settles into the warm dark around you, consider what it means that a cartoon has been accurately describing these things for 36 years. What it means that the most honest extended portrait of American life has been delivered in animated form by a yellow-skinned family with 4 fingers and perfect hair that defies the laws of physics. Consider what it says about us that we needed the cartoon version to be able to look at ourselves clearly, that the satire was necessary, that the exaggeration was what made the accuracy bearable. Consider Homer, a man who is by every objective measure failing. His job is technically important and practically negligent. His house is repeatedly at risk. His children are variously struggling. His ambitions consistently exceed his capabilities. He is not a success by any conventional definition of the word. And yet, he loves his family with a completeness that very few fictional characters have ever achieved. His love is not eloquent or sophisticated or particularly self-aware. It is just completely and entirely real. He would do anything, survive anything, endure anything, for Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie. The predictions are interesting. Homer's love is important. If there is one thing The Simpsons has been consistently right about across 36 years, and every cultural shift, and every technological transformation, and every political upheaval, it is that the thing that matters most is the love between the people on the couch. Everything else, the power plant and the billionaire and the impossible town and the predictions about the future, is context. The family is the point. That has been true since the 17th of December 1989. It will be true long after the last prediction has been either vindicated or forgotten. Springfield will be there. The family will be there. And you, watching from wherever you are, whatever time it is, are part of it now. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. We have spent the bulk of tonight on the headline predictions, the ones that generated viral screenshots and think pieces and endless online discussion. But The Simpsons made hundreds of smaller, quieter observations over the years that turned out to be accurate in ways that have received far less attention. Let us spend some time with those, because they illuminate something important about the show's method that the famous predictions alone do not quite reveal. In a 1994 episode, the show depicted a character experiencing road rage, the specific kind of elevated, irrational anger that driving a car in traffic seems to provoke in otherwise reasonable people. The character is not particularly angry in other contexts. Behind the wheel, something changes. The isolation of the car, the relative anonymity, the frustration of delays, and the perceived rudeness of other drivers, all of it combines into a behavior that the show treated as both funny and recognizable. The term road rage was coined in the mid-1980s, so the concept was not new when The Simpsons depicted it. But the show's depiction anticipated the way that road rage would become a significant social and legal issue in the subsequent decades, as cars became more common and traffic became denser, and the specific psychology of driving became better understood. The character of the enraged driver, someone who is fundamentally decent in other contexts but who becomes a different person behind the wheel, is now a cultural archetype. The Simpsons drew it clearly in 1994. In a 1998 episode, there is a brief reference to the idea of someone becoming famous purely for being famous, for having a public profile that is not anchored to any particular talent or achievement, but is sustained entirely by the visibility itself. This was, in 1998, a recognizable but still relatively unusual phenomenon. The machinery of celebrity culture that produces people who are famous for being famous had not yet fully developed. The early 2000s changed that. Reality television created a whole ecosystem of celebrity that was explicitly not anchored to conventional talent or achievement. The internet amplified this tendency enormously. The influencer economy of the 2010s and 2020s is fundamentally an economy of people who are famous for being visible, whose celebrity is produced by their willingness to be public rather than by any conventional form of achievement. The Simpsons was pointing at this dynamic in 1998, well before the term influencer existed and before the technical infrastructure of social media had created the conditions for it to become economically significant. The observation was social rather than technical, about a pattern in celebrity culture that was already visible in embryonic form. The show followed it to its logical conclusion and found something recognizable: the person whose fame is entirely self-referential, who is known for being known. In 2001, the show depicted a character who has become addicted to his phone, who checks it compulsively, who is unable to be present in social situations because his attention is perpetually fragmented by the device in his hand. This was 2001. The iPhone did not exist. Smartphones did not exist in any form recognizable to a contemporary user. What did exist, in 2001, was the BlackBerry and various early mobile email devices that had begun to create exactly the dynamic the show was depicting among early adopters in business and professional contexts. The show was observing an emergent behavior in a narrow population and depicting its logic and its social costs in a way that proved to be accurate for the much larger population that would eventually have smartphones. The compulsive phone checker did not become a universal figure until the early 2010s. But the behavior, and the social costs of the behavior, and the specific quality of presence-absent social interaction that it produces were visible to careful observers in 2001. The Simpsons was among those observers. In a 2004 episode, the show depicted a character who has outsourced the work of having opinions. Rather than forming views through direct engagement with information and argument, The character subscribes to a service that provides pre-packaged opinions on any topic, complete with talking points and rhetorical strategies for defending those opinions in social situations. The joke is about intellectual laziness, about the desire to have opinions without the effort of forming them. That joke hit differently in 2024. The ecosystem of social media, partisan media, algorithm-driven content feeds, and identity-based information consumption has created exactly the dynamic the show was describing. The opinions are delivered pre-packaged. The talking points are optimized for the social context in which they will be deployed. The intellectual work of forming one's own views has been, for a significant portion of the population, outsourced to platforms and personalities and tribal information ecosystems. The Simpsons was joking about this in 2004, before social media existed in any form that would make it a structural reality. The underlying tendency was visible in the media environment of 2004. The show followed the tendency to its logical extreme and found something that 20 years later looked less like an extreme and more like an accurate description. In a 1996 episode, there is a passing reference to the health consequences of sitting for long periods, of a sedentary lifestyle, of the specific kind of physical deterioration that results not from strenuous activity but from its absence. This was, in 1996, a relatively new area of medical concern. The understanding that prolonged sitting was itself a health risk, independent of other lifestyle factors, was emerging from epidemiological research but had not yet entered mainstream public health discourse. The sit-stand desk, the 10,000 steps a day recommendation, the culture of workplace wellness designed to counteract the physical consequences of office work, all of that developed in the 2000s and 2010s. As the research on sedentary behavior accumulated and the public health establishment began to communicate its findings to a general audience. The Simpsons was noting the concern in 1996, not as a major plot point, not as a health-focused storyline, as a passing observational joke that required enough knowledge of the emerging research to construct, but that would land for an audience that recognized, even in 1996, something true about the relationship between sedentary modern life and physical well-being. What all of these smaller predictions have in common is the quality of observation from which they emerge. Each one is based on a visible trend that had not yet fully expressed itself at the time the episode was made. Each one required the writers to understand the trend clearly enough to follow it to a plausible conclusion. And each one turned out to be right, not in the dramatic headline way of the Trump or pandemic predictions, but in the quiet, steady way of someone who noticed something true early and described it before the rest of the world caught up. The famous predictions are the evidence that gets cited, but the smaller predictions, accumulated across hundreds of episodes and decades, are the evidence that the observation was real, that the show was genuinely watching the world in dozens of domains simultaneously and writing down what it saw. That is a remarkable thing to have been doing for 36 years. Whatever happens next in Springfield, whatever predictions are still waiting to come true, the accumulated record of what the show has already gotten right is a testament to something genuinely extraordinary. The show watched America. For 36 years, it kept watching, and what it saw, it described. Some of what it described has not yet arrived. Some of it arrived so quietly that nobody noticed, and some of it arrived with a crash, in the form of news events and corporate announcements and scientific discoveries that sent people rushing back to old episodes to find the frames that matched. All of it, in the end, came from the same place, from writers who paid attention, from a show that cared enough about the world it was depicting to describe it honestly, even when honesty required following a joke to somewhere uncomfortable. That is The Simpsons. That is what it has always been. A cartoon that paid attention, and a world that, year after year, keeps giving it reasons to have been right. There is a version of the Simpsons prediction story that does not get told often enough, and it has to do not with what the show predicted but with how the predictions are found and shared and discussed. The Simpsons existed for more than a decade before the internet was a mass medium. Its first seasons, its most celebrated seasons, were made and broadcast in a world where the primary means of cultural conversation was television itself, supplemented by print media, by word of mouth, by the specific kind of cultural transmission that happened in school hallways and office break rooms and bars. In that world, a Simpsons prediction that turned out to be right would have circulated slowly, carried by individuals who remembered the relevant episode and made the connection to the current event. The news of the coincidence would have spread through networks of people who happened to overlap in their knowledge of both the show and the world. The internet changed all of that. Once the show's archive became searchable, and once the tools for capturing and sharing screenshots and video clips became universally available, the process of identifying predictions accelerated enormously. A current event could be matched to a Simpsons episode in minutes by anyone with the right search skills and the right databases. This change in how predictions are found has had a significant effect on the predictions themselves, or rather on our perception of them. Before the internet, the predictions that were noticed were primarily the ones that were noticed by people who happened to have the relevant knowledge stored in personal memory. The universe of findable predictions was limited by the universe of people with the right combination of encyclopedic Simpsons knowledge and access to current events. After the internet, the universe of findable predictions expanded enormously. More people with more tools, looking through more material, found more connections. The rate at which Simpsons predictions were identified and shared accelerated with the growth of the internet as a mass medium. This means that the apparent frequency of Simpsons predictions has increased over time, not necessarily because the show is making more accurate predictions, but because our ability to find and share the predictions has improved. The predictions were always there. We have become better at finding them. This is not a reason to dismiss the predictions. The ones that are genuinely accurate remain genuinely accurate regardless of whether they were found quickly or slowly. But it is a reason to calibrate our amazement appropriately. When a Simpsons prediction goes viral in 2025, part of what we are experiencing is the effect of a very efficient searching and sharing infrastructure applied to a very large archive. That infrastructure did not exist in 1995. The predictions were accumulating in the archive, waiting to be found, for years or decades before the tools that would find them were built. In a sense, the internet is the mechanism that makes the Simpsons predictions visible, the way a telescope makes distant stars visible. The stars existed before the telescope. The telescope makes them findable. The internet made the predictions findable. The predictions existed before the internet made them findable. That is a distinction worth keeping in mind as we marvel at the show's apparent prescience. The show was always doing what it was always doing. We got better at seeing it. There is one more thing worth saying about the internet and the predictions, and it connects to something we discussed at the beginning of tonight about the show's cultural influence. The internet has not just made Simpsons predictions more visible, it has made them more powerful as cultural artifacts. A prediction that goes viral in 2024 reaches hundreds of millions of people. Its effect on the cultural imagination, the way it shapes how people think about the present moment and the direction things are heading, is vastly larger than the effect of the same prediction circulating through word of mouth in 1995. This means that the show's cultural influence, its capacity to shape how people understand their world, has actually grown in the internet age rather than diminishing, as the show itself has aged. The older episodes, the ones that contained the most prescient observations, are now the most powerful cultural artifacts in the show's archive because they combine genuine accuracy with the amplification that viral sharing provides. The Simpsons is, paradoxically, more culturally influential now than it was during its peak ratings period, because the infrastructure that makes its predictions visible did not exist when those predictions were being made. That is a genuinely unusual situation for a piece of art to be in. Most things that are made in one era become less influential as time passes and contexts change and new things are made. The Simpsons, because of the specific nature of its content and the specific nature of the internet age that followed it, has become more influential over time in certain specific ways. The predictions are the mechanism of that increasing influence. Each new confirmation, each new viral moment of recognition, extends the show's reach into the present and makes the archive feel more alive than it would otherwise be. Springfield endures, the show endures, and the internet, which was itself anticipated by the show in various ways, has become the medium through which the show's endurance is expressed. That is perhaps the most recursive of all the Simpsons predictions. The show predicted the internet age in various ways. The internet age has made the show more powerful. The show's increased power in the internet age has generated more discussion of how the show predicted the internet age. The loop is real, and like Homer's donut universe, it curves back on itself in a way that is difficult to escape and, in certain lights, quite beautiful. The show has been running since 1989. It is still running. The predictions are still being found. The archive is still being searched. And somewhere in 36 seasons of episodes, there is probably something that describes exactly this. the moment you are in right now. Watching or listening to a long video about a show that keeps getting the future right, in the quiet of the late night or the early morning, wherever in the world you happen to be. Springfield knows you are there. It always does. We have spent a great deal of tonight discussing predictions about the external world, about technology and politics and corporate affairs and science. But some of the show's most accurate predictions have been about something much closer, about the interior life of a marriage and the specific challenges and textures of long-term partnership. Homer and Marge Simpson have been married, within the show's floating timeline, for the entirety of the show's run. Their relationship has been explored in more depth and with more honesty than almost any other long-term partnership in the history of television comedy. And some of what the show observed about their marriage has proven to be remarkably accurate about the dynamics of contemporary partnership. The show depicted, consistently and clearly, the way that the labor of domestic life is distributed unequally. Marge does the majority of the household work. She manages the family's logistics, the schedules, and the groceries and the school events and the medical appointments. She is the person who knows where things are, who remembers what needs to be done, who holds the operational details of family life in her head. Homer is largely unaware of this work, not maliciously unaware, not deliberately oblivious. He genuinely does not register the labor that Marge is doing because the labor is, in a certain sense, invisible. It happens in the background. Its absence would be noticed immediately. Its presence is taken for granted. This dynamic, which researchers and writers about domestic labor have called the mental load or cognitive labor, was not commonly discussed in those terms in 1989 when the show began. The academic and journalistic conversation about the unequal distribution of household cognitive labor developed primarily in the 2000s and 2010s and reached mainstream cultural awareness only in the mid-2010s. The Simpsons was depicting the dynamic from its very first episodes. Marge's exhaustion, Homer's well-meaning obliviousness, the specific tension that arises when one partner in a marriage does a kind of work that the other does not see and therefore does not value. These were the emotional raw material of dozens of Simpsons storylines. When the conversation about the mental load became mainstream in the 2010s, people who watched the show recognized immediately what was being described. Marge had been living it for 25 years. The show had been depicting it honestly the whole time. The cultural conversation had simply not yet developed the vocabulary to name what the show was showing. That is a prediction in a different register than the Trump prediction or the pandemic prediction. It is a prediction about what would become a significant cultural conversation, made by showing the thing the conversation would eventually be about without ever using the words the conversation would use to describe it. The show was ahead of the discourse by about 25 years. There is another dimension to the Homer-Marge relationship that the show depicted with unusual accuracy, and it has to do with the way long-term partnerships navigate the difference between who you married and who that person becomes over time. Homer and Marge met when they were teenagers. They fell in love quickly, married young, and have been together ever since. The show has depicted, in hundreds of episodes, the way the person you chose at one point in your life becomes, gradually and imperceptibly, a somewhat different person. Not unrecognizable, not disconnected from the person you chose, but changed, grown, developed in directions that the person who made the choice could not entirely have anticipated. Marge chose Homer when Homer was a young man with a certain kind of potential. The Homer she ended up with is a different person than the Homer she might have imagined she was choosing. More limited in some ways, more himself in others. The show has always been honest about the distance between what Marge imagined and what Homer turned out to be, and equally honest about the love that persists and deepens despite, or perhaps because of, that distance. That dynamic, the gap between the person you chose and the person that person became, is one of the most universal and least discussed experiences of long-term partnership. It is not the same as disappointment, exactly. It is more like the continuous adjustment required by the fact that the person you love is a real person who changes in ways that were not specified in the original contract. The Simpsons depicted this dynamic honestly and repeatedly, and with genuine warmth, over 36 years of a marriage that neither partner ever seriously considered ending. The show understood that the gap between expectation and reality in a long marriage is not a failure. It is the marriage itself. It is what the marriage is made of. Contemporary research on long-term relationship satisfaction has increasingly emphasized exactly this theme. The couples who report the highest satisfaction over long periods are often those who have developed a realistic understanding of their partners, who have made peace with the distance between the person they imagined they were choosing and the person they actually chose, and who have found in that real person something worth continuing to choose. The Simpsons was depicting the emotional truth of this for 36 years before the research developed the vocabulary to describe it. That is a prediction, or something very like one, about the inner life of marriage, about what long-term love actually looks like when you stay close enough to it to see it clearly. The show got that right too, not with a screenshot comparison and a viral moment, but quietly, episode after episode, for 3.5 decades. That is, perhaps, the most important thing it got right. Springfield is unusual among fictional places in one specific and important way. It knows what it is. Most fictional settings are simply stages for human drama. The setting provides context, atmosphere, constraint. It shapes the stories that can be told within it. But it does not, as a rule, have opinions about itself. It does not observe itself. It does not make jokes at its own expense. Springfield is different. The town has, throughout the show's run, demonstrated a kind of self-awareness about its own nature that is unusual for a fictional setting. The Springfield residents know they live in a peculiar place. They know their town has problems that other towns do not have. They know their lives contain elements of absurdity that warrant acknowledgement. They just choose, most of the time, not to dwell on it. This knowing self-awareness, combined with the systematic refusal to act on that awareness, is perhaps the most accurate thing the show has ever depicted about American life. America as a culture is extraordinarily self-aware. Americans produce an enormous volume of self-criticism, self-analysis, self-examination. The country has one of the most robust and sustained traditions of cultural critique in the world. The problems of American society are not hidden. They are discussed endlessly, analyzed from every angle, depicted in art and literature and comedy and journalism with extraordinary thoroughness. And yet, the problems persist. The awareness does not translate reliably into change. The knowledge of the diagnosis does not consistently produce the behavior that the diagnosis prescribes. Springfield understands this about itself and depicts it without judgment, which is perhaps the most generous thing the show does. The town's residents are not stupid. They are not particularly malicious. They are people who know something is wrong and have made a collective decision, mostly unconscious, to live with the wrongness rather than undertake the disruption that fixing it would require. That is not a cartoon pathology. That is a human one. Communities across America, across the world, have always been better at knowing what is wrong than at changing what is wrong. The gap between diagnosis and treatment, between awareness and action, is one of the most persistent features of human social life. The Simpsons depicted that gap honestly and repeatedly, through Springfield's relationship with the power plant and with Burns, and with its own history of catastrophes that are processed and forgotten and then repeated. Whether that constitutes prediction is debatable. It might be more accurate to call it description, an ongoing, accurate description of a persistent feature of human social behavior that shows up in Springfield because it shows up everywhere. But description and prediction are not always clearly distinguishable. A description that is accurate in 1989 and remains accurate in 2025 is, in its own way, predictive. It predicts that the thing it describes will continue to be true. And when the thing continues to be true, the description is validated. The Simpsons described the gap between awareness and action in 1989, and the gap has continued to be one of the defining features of American public life. That is, in its quiet way, the most consistently accurate prediction the show has ever made. Springfield knows what is wrong. Springfield does not fix it. And every Sunday night, in a different year and a different cultural context, the show about Springfield is still on, because it is still relevant, because the gap is still there, because we still recognize, in the yellow-skinned residents of that impossible town, something true about ourselves and the world we live in. That recognition, sustained over 36 years, is the real prediction. We recognized ourselves in Springfield in 1989. We recognized ourselves again in 2000 and 2010 and 2020 and now. The show predicted that we would keep recognizing ourselves in it. And so far, across every change and every shift and every upheaval, that prediction has been right. It is the most humble and the most confident prediction in the show's history. We will keep watching, it said, because we will keep recognizing ourselves. We have, every year, we are tonight. That is Springfield. That is The Simpsons. That is what 36 years of careful, honest, affectionate observation produces. A place that knows you before you know it. A family that keeps being yours, no matter how old you get or how much the world changes around you. A show that has been right about so many things, large and small, public and private, cosmic and domestic, because it was made by people who paid attention. And tonight, in the quiet, you are paying attention too. That is enough. That is everything. Springfield will be there in the morning. It always is. There is a version of this story about The Simpsons and its predictions that we have not yet fully told, and it has to do with the physical space where the predictions were made. The writer's room of The Simpsons, at least during its celebrated peak years, was a place where intellectual seriousness and gleeful absurdity coexisted in a way that was, by the accounts of everyone who worked there, unusual to the point of being remarkable. The room worked according to a process that was both exhausting and generative. Story ideas were pitched, debated, revised, discarded, and reconsidered. Jokes were tried out loud and evaluated by whether they produced genuine laughter or the more polite response that writers in rooms learned to recognize as insufficient. The standard for what made it onto the page was extremely high, maintained by the collective judgment of a group of very funny, very smart, very competitive people. In that environment, cultural references and observations from the real world were constant raw material. Writers brought in things they had read, things they had seen, things they had been thinking about. The room was, in a real sense, a concentrated intelligence about the world, a space where multiple highly educated and extremely observant people were simultaneously processing current events, cultural trends, scientific developments, corporate news, and political dynamics. Ideas entered the room from every domain. A writer who had been following the health physics literature might bring in an observation about radiation exposure. A writer who had been reading about media consolidation might note a trend toward concentration of ownership. A writer with a background in mathematics might propose a visual joke that required a real equation. A writer who had been tracking Trump's political ambitions since the late 1980s might suggest using his name as a satirical shorthand. In the room, those individual observations were combined, refined, and turned into comedy. The process filtered out the things that were interesting but not funny, the things that were funny but not true, and the things that were neither. What remained, after the filtering, was material that was both genuinely funny and genuinely accurate about the world. That filtering process is what produced the predictions. Not individually, not from any single writer's foresight, but collectively, from the accumulated intelligence of a room full of people who were serious about getting things right. This is a more prosaic explanation than prophecy, but it is also, in its own way, more impressive. Prophecy would require one person to have extraordinary access to the future. What The Simpsons had was a system, a process for collective observation and evaluation that consistently produced accurate satirical observations about the direction of American life. Systems that produce good results consistently are rarer and more valuable than individual moments of brilliance. The Simpsons writing room, during its peak, was a system that produced consistently good results because the people in it were excellent and the process was well designed and the standards were uncompromising. The predictions are the output of that system. The specific names and dates and events are the details. The system is what made them possible. Understanding the system is ultimately more valuable than marveling at the outputs. Because the system can be learned from, the outputs are historically specific, tied to a particular show at a particular moment. The system is transferable. The habits of observation and analysis and honest extrapolation that produce The Simpsons' predictions are habits that anyone can cultivate, in any domain, with sufficient dedication. The show was right about a lot of things. But the most important thing it was right about is also the least dramatic, that if you pay attention to the world with sufficient care and honesty and intellectual seriousness, and if you are willing to follow what you observe to its logical conclusions, even when those conclusions are uncomfortable, you will sometimes arrive at truths that the world has not yet caught up to. That is not magic. That is craft. And craft, applied consistently over a long enough period, produces results that look, from the outside, like something more than craft. That is The Simpsons. That is always what it has been. We have discussed the floating timeline as one of the show's structural features. the mechanism by which the characters remain perpetually the same age while the world around them continues to change. We touched on some of the theories about why the timeline floats, but there is a dimension of the floating timeline that connects directly to the predictions, and it deserves its own extended exploration. The floating timeline means that the characters of The Simpsons exist in a permanent present tense. When an episode airs in 2025, the characters are living in 2025. When an episode aired in 1995, the characters were living in 1995. The year changes, the technology changes, the cultural references change, but the characters do not. This means that the show has, over 36 years, depicted the same family navigating an enormous range of different present moments. Homer and Marge in the 1980s, Homer and Marge in the 1990s, Homer and Marge in the 2000s, the 2010s, the 2020s, the same people, the same relationships, the same emotional dynamics, played out against completely different cultural backdrops. What this produces across the full archive of the show is something remarkable. You can watch the same family navigate the same kinds of problems across radically different technological and cultural contexts. You can see how the dynamics that produced conflict in a world without smartphones produce similar conflicts in a world defined by them. You can see how the emotional architecture of the Simpson household, its specific combination of love and frustration and chaos and renewal, adapts to whatever the current moment is throwing at it. This is, in a quiet way, one of the most important observations the show has ever made. The fundamental emotional dynamics of family life are more stable than the cultural contexts in which they play out. Homer's relationship with his job, his insecurity and his love and his frustration and his loyalty is legible in 1989 and in 2025 because the emotional content is constant, even as the specific circumstances change. Marge's balancing act between her own desires and the needs of the people she loves is legible in 1989 and in 2025 for the same reason. The specific pressures change. The underlying dynamic does not. The floating timeline is the mechanism that makes this observation possible. By refusing to let the characters age, the show creates a kind of longitudinal study of the same emotional lives across different historical moments. And what that study finds across 36 years of evidence is that the emotional architecture of human relationships is remarkably stable. That is a prediction, or the foundation of many predictions. It predicts that the same kinds of stories will remain relevant across time, that the emotional truths the show is depicting in 1995 will still be emotional truths in 2025. And that prediction has been consistently correct. The older episodes of The Simpsons are not historical artifacts that require translation for contemporary audiences. They are, for the most part, immediately legible. The emotions are still recognizable. The dynamics are still familiar. The show predicted its own continued relevance by understanding that what makes it relevant is not topical but structural. The cultural references age, the emotional core does not. That is perhaps the most quietly confident prediction in the show's history. We will still matter in 30 years, the show said implicitly, by building its emotional architecture on foundations that do not erode with time. It was right. There is one more dimension of the floating timeline worth exploring, and it connects to the prediction phenomenon in a specific way. Because the characters do not age, the show has been able to revisit the same characters in the same situations across different historical moments, and the revisiting has been genuinely illuminating. An episode about Homer's relationship with his job in 1993 and an episode about Homer's relationship with his job in 2023 are not the same episode. The cultural context is different, the specific pressures are different, the technological mediation of work is different. But the emotional core, the anxiety and the loyalty and the need for meaning and recognition is continuous. When viewers in 2023 watch that 1993 episode, they see both the historical specificity, the 1993-ness of it, and the contemporary relevance, the 2023-ness of the emotional content. The episode exists simultaneously in two times, the historical moment of its making and the present moment of its viewing. That temporal doubleness is unique to The Simpsons among long-running television shows, precisely because the floating timeline allows the show to keep being present tense. Other shows from the 1990s exist in the 1990s when you watch them. The characters are aging in real time within the show's fictional universe. The stories are rooted in the specific historical moment of their making, in a way that makes them feel like historical documents. The Simpsons, because Homer is still Homer and the family is still the family, exists in both the past and the present simultaneously. The 1993 episode is a 1993 episode, and it is also a now episode, because Homer's situation is still recognizable and still real. That is an extraordinary achievement, and it is, among other things, a form of prediction. The show predicted that its own emotional content would remain relevant across the cultural changes of the subsequent decades, and it was right. The floating timeline is not just a production convenience. It is the show's most sophisticated formal prediction. The claim, embedded in the show's structure, that the things it is about are the things that do not change. Love and frustration and failure and renewal, and the specific, improbable bond between people who chose each other or did not choose each other and ended up together anyway. Those things do not change. The Simpsons predicted that they would not. And 36 years later, watching the same family navigate a world that is unrecognizable from the one the show was made in, the prediction holds. It will hold tomorrow, and the day after. As we draw toward the end of tonight, let us take one last slow walk through Springfield. It is evening in Springfield. The light is warm and amber the way it always is in the show's visual language, a kind of perpetual early evening that makes the impossible town feel hospitable even when it is at its strangest. The power plant is visible in the distance, its cooling towers releasing gentle plumes into the air that nobody in Springfield thinks twice about. The quick E-Mart is lit from within, Apu visible through the glass, ready for whatever the night might bring. Moe's Tavern sign flickers on the corner, reliable and dimly inviting. On Evergreen Terrace, the house is lit. Through the front window, visible from the street, you can see the family. Homer on the couch, one hand probably reaching for something that is not there. Marge in the kitchen, the quiet hub around which the household orbits. Bart somewhere between trouble and bed. Lisa in her room, saxophone on her knee, reading something that nobody else in the family would read. And Maggie in the silence, watching everything. This town has predicted a Trump presidency. It has predicted a pandemic. It has depicted a corporate merger 21 years before it happened. It has written equations that approximate the mass of undiscovered particles. It has imagined commercial space tourism, smartwatches, on-demand information, autocorrect failures, video calls, orchestral hip-hop collaborations, and the toroidal geometry of the universe. It has done all of this in service of one idea. The idea that there is a family on a couch, on a street in a town, and that family is your family, and that street is your street, and that town is your town, and none of it will last forever, and all of it matters. The predictions are how Springfield shows you that it has been paying attention, that it knows the world you are living in, that it was here before the things that define your world arrived, and it will be here after they have passed, and through all of it. The family is on the couch, and the street is quiet, and the evening light is amber, and everything that matters is still intact. The show has been watching America for 36 years, and in watching America, in describing it honestly and loving it and laughing at it and grieving for it and never quite giving up on it, the show has accumulated a kind of knowledge that is deeper than any single prediction. It knows that the things that break communities are real, and that the things that hold communities together are realer. It knows that the people who do the invisible work are the ones worth paying attention to. It knows that intelligence without love is incomplete, and that love without intelligence is fragile. It knows that the children you raise are watching everything, and that what they see in you is what they become. It knows that the world will keep changing faster than any of us can fully absorb, and that the emotional constants will survive the changes, and that the family on the couch will still be recognizably itself on the other side of whatever comes next. These are not predictions with screenshot comparisons. They are not the kind of observations that generate viral moments and articles and discussions about whether the show has access to some form of foreknowledge. They are just true. True in the way that the deepest things the best art ever does is true. Not as facts that can be verified against a record, but as recognitions that land somewhere beneath analysis, that feel like the description of something you already knew but had not found the words for. The Simpsons has been finding words for things its audience already knew but had not articulated for 36 years. That is the show's real gift. Not prophecy, not supernatural foresight, just the patient, loving, honest articulation of things that are true about human beings and the lives they lead together. The predictions are the dramatic expression of that gift. The quiet moments are the deeper one. And on a night like tonight, with the world still going wherever it is going, and the family still on the couch, and Springfield still somehow managing to be both impossible and completely real, the quiet moments are what we carry with us into sleep. Close your eyes. The town is there. The family is there. The prediction has not yet arrived, whatever it is, whatever Springfield has been quietly preparing us for. But when it does, we will recognize it. Because we have been watching. Because the Simpsons taught us how. Good night, from Springfield. We will see you in the next episode. We always do. One of the most consistent and most accurate observations The Simpsons has made across its entire run concerns the nature of authority and the way that institutions exercise power over the people within them. Burns is the most obvious example, the billionaire whose power is absolute within Springfield's economic sphere, who uses that power without particular malice but with complete indifference to the welfare of the people subject to it. He is not cartoonishly evil in the way that many fictional villains are. He is something more accurate and more disturbing. He is simply someone for whom other people's welfare is not a consideration in his decision-making. Not because he actively dislikes other people, because other people simply do not factor into his calculations at all. That portrait of concentrated economic power, of the billionaire who is not cruel so much as simply unreachable by ordinary moral considerations, has proven to be one of the show's most durable and most accurately predictive observations. The public discourse about extreme wealth and its relationship to social responsibility has evolved significantly since 1989. The specific terms of the argument have changed. The specific examples have changed. But the dynamic the show identified, the way that sufficient wealth creates a kind of insulation from ordinary human accountability, the way that the very wealthy develop a relationship with the world that is different in kind from the relationship that ordinary people have with it, has remained a central feature of American public life. Burns is the prototype. He was drawn clearly in 1989, and every subsequent version of the American billionaire who is too wealthy to be constrained by ordinary social norms is recognizable as a descendant of Burns. That is not a prediction of specific individuals. It is a prediction of a type, and of the conditions that produce that type. The conditions have not changed. The type has continued to be produced by those conditions. And Burns remains the clearest and most vivid depiction of what the type looks like at its most extreme. Similarly, the show's treatment of institutional authority, of police and politicians and judges and administrators, has proven to be remarkably accurate about the ways in which those institutions fail to serve the people they are ostensibly designed to protect. Chief Wiggum is stupid and self-interested, and often corrupt, but he is not malicious in any sustained or motivated way. He is simply inadequate to his job, and his inadequacy is protected by institutional inertia and the absence of any real accountability. Springfield's police department is not effective. It is also not going away. The two facts coexist without generating any particular pressure for change, because the mechanisms of accountability that might produce change are themselves part of the institutional landscape that Wiggum inhabits. That portrait of institutional failure, the police force that does not work and is not going to stop not working because the feedback mechanisms that might produce change do not function, has been validated over and over in the decades since the show began. The specific forms of institutional failure change. The underlying dynamic, the way that institutions develop self-preserving inertia that insulates them from the accountability that their nominal function requires, does not. The show understood this in 1989. It is still understanding it in 2025. And the world, year after year, keeps providing the examples that confirm the understanding. In a slightly different register, the show's treatment of local government, of the Springfield City Council and the mayor, and the various administrative apparatus that governs the town's public life, has been one of its most consistently accurate observations. Mayor Quimby is corrupt and self-interested, and more concerned with his own position and pleasure than with the welfare of Springfield's citizens. He is also reasonably competent in the specific skill of maintaining his position, of navigating the political terrain of a small city in a way that keeps him in power regardless of how badly he governs. He is not good at governance. He is very good at politics. That distinction between skill at politics and skill at governance, and the way that the two skills are not the same and do not always appear in the same person, is one of the show's most perceptive political observations. The ability to win elections is not the same as the ability to use power wisely once you have won them. A political system that selects primarily for the first skill will frequently produce leaders who lack the second. The Simpsons understood this in 1989. In the person of Mayor Quimby, American politics has continued to produce examples of the type in the decades since. The observation was accurate in 1989 and remains accurate now. These institutional observations are predictions in the structural sense. They predict that the dynamics they describe will continue to operate, that the conditions producing the dysfunction they depict will not be resolved quickly or easily, that the world of 2025 will still contain the recognizable descendants of the patterns the show identified in the early 1990s. Those predictions have been consistently correct. Springfield's institutions are America's institutions, described with the clarity that comes from affectionate distance. And the America of 2025, looking at its own institutions, can still find its reflection in the impossible town on the western, eastern, northern, and southern edge of the country that does not appear on any map. That recognition, sustained across 36 years, is its own kind of prediction come true. The show knew the world it was drawing, and the world it was drawing did not change as much as any of us might have hoped. That is not a comfortable observation, but it is an honest one. And honesty, across 36 years, is what the show has always offered. There is a dimension of Bart Simpson that does not get enough attention in discussions of the show's predictions and cultural accuracy, and it has to do with what Bart represents as a generational type. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old since 1989. He has been 10 years old through 6 different presidents, through the internet age, through the smartphone revolution, through social media and streaming and all of the other transformations that have redefined daily life in the decades since the show began. And through all of it, Bart has remained the same. Clever, impulsive, resistant to authority, capable of genuine warmth that he would rather die than express openly, possessed of a creativity that his formal education is entirely unable to reach or recognize. He is the student that the school system is not built for, the child that conventional metrics of success cannot measure, the person that every institutional structure encounters and does not quite know what to do with. The generation that grew up watching Bart in the 1990s is now in their 30s and 40s, and a significant portion of that generation has articulated, in various ways, a relationship with institutional authority that looks recognizable as Bart-inflected. The skepticism of institutions, the preference for informal networks over formal ones, the distrust of expertise that presents itself without accountability, the insistence on authenticity, even when authenticity is inconvenient or messy or insufficiently respectable, these are not purely the result of watching Bart Simpson. They are produced by a complex interaction of historical experience, economic circumstance, and cultural exposure. But Bart was part of that cultural exposure, one of the clearest and most vivid images of a particular relationship with authority available to a generation of children who were forming their understanding of the world. The show predicted, in Bart, a generational type, not through deliberate forecast, through accurate observation of a recurring human type, the creative rebel who is perpetually in tension with institutional demands, combined with the particular cultural moment of the early 1990s and the particular anxieties of that moment. The type persisted. The generations that followed the Bart generation inherited the archetype and found it still useful, still recognizable, still accurate about something true about the relationship between individuals and the systems they inhabit. That is a softer kind of prediction than the Trump prediction or the pandemic prediction, but it may be, over the long term, a more significant one. The cultural archetypes that a generation absorbs in childhood shape how that generation thinks and acts and relates to the world for decades afterward. Bart Simpson, absorbed by millions of children in the 1990s, is part of the cultural vocabulary that those children brought into adulthood. The show predicted, in Bart, something about who those children would become, not with precision, not with specific detail, but with enough accuracy to be recognizable in retrospect. That is the show operating at its deepest level, not predicting events, predicting people. And that prediction, the one about who the Bart generation would turn out to be, has been unfolding continuously for 36 years. It is still unfolding now. In every adult who remembers watching Bart as a child, in every choice to question rather than comply, in every moment of creative resistance to institutional demand, in every instance of someone choosing to be themselves rather than what the system needs them to be, That is Bart's legacy. That is what the show predicted when it created him. Not a political event, not a technological development, a human type, and the relationship that type would have with a world not designed to accommodate it. The prediction has been validated, continuously, for 36 years, and Bart, 10 years old and entirely himself, continues to skateboard past whatever the current moment is throwing at him, unimpressed and undefeated. That is the most Bart thing possible, and it is the most Springfield thing possible, and it is, ultimately, the most American thing possible. The kid who would not be contained, who would not be quiet, who found a way to be himself in every possible circumstance, at the cost of every possible official approval. The show has been telling that story since 1989. It is still true. If Bart represents one archetype the show created and the world validated, Lisa represents another. And the validation of Lisa's archetype is in some ways more poignant than the validation of Bart's. Lisa Simpson is brilliant. She has been brilliant since the first episode, and she has remained brilliant across 36 years of the show's run. Her intelligence is genuine, her curiosity is genuine, her desire to make the world better is genuine. She plays the saxophone with a kind of emotion that exceeds her years. She reads books that nobody around her has read. She forms moral commitments based on careful reasoning and holds to them even when those commitments make her unpopular. And Springfield does not know what to do with her. The school does not know how to teach her. Her family loves her but does not always understand her. Her peer group finds her exhausting. The community treats her intelligence as something slightly suspect, something that sets her apart in ways that are not entirely comfortable. Lisa is right, constantly, about a remarkable range of things. And being right does not help her. It does not make her popular. It does not make her life easier. It does not generate the recognition and acceptance she needs. If anything, being right tends to make things harder, because being right in a context where the people around you are wrong creates a specific kind of isolation that is difficult to resolve. The show has depicted this with unusual honesty. Lisa is not rewarded for her intelligence by the world she lives in. She is tolerated, sometimes celebrated in limited ways, occasionally acknowledged, but the sustained recognition that her abilities warrant is consistently withheld, usually without malice, by a world that simply is not organized to value what she offers. This portrait of brilliant, frustrated, isolated intelligence, of the person who sees clearly and is right about what they see and pays a social cost for that clarity, has proven to be one of the show's most durable and most widely recognized observations. The conversation about gifted education, about what schools do and do not do for highly intelligent children, about the specific social challenges that exceptional intelligence creates, has developed significantly in the decades since Lisa first appeared. Research on the social and emotional development of gifted children has consistently confirmed what the show depicted. High intelligence does not protect against isolation. It can, in certain social environments, make isolation more likely and more difficult to address. The show knew this in 1989. It depicted it clearly and honestly, not as a tragedy that needed to be fixed, but as a persistent feature of Lisa's life that she navigates with varying degrees of success and failure. Lisa does not overcome her isolation. She learns, over the course of many episodes, to live with it, to find moments of genuine connection, to derive meaning from her own standards even when external validation is insufficient. That is an accurate depiction of how highly intelligent people often navigate the world, not with triumphant success and universal recognition, with persistent effort, intermittent connection, and the sustaining awareness of their own understanding, even when that understanding is not reflected back by the world around them. The prediction embedded in Lisa's character is that this type of person will continue to exist, will continue to face the same challenges, and will continue to find the same kinds of inadequate but sustaining compensations. The brilliant child who is too much for the systems designed to contain and educate and socialize children. The adult who is right about things that the consensus is wrong about. The person who values the truth of what she sees more than the comfort of being seen as acceptable. These types persist. They were present in 1989 when Lisa was created. They are present in 2025. They will be present in 2045. The specific cultural context changes. The archetype does not. The show predicted the persistence of the archetype by depicting it with enough accuracy and enough love that it remains recognizable across time. Every child who has ever been too smart for their class, and felt the loneliness of that position has seen themselves in Lisa. Every adult who has ever been right about something important and been ignored for it has seen themselves in Lisa. Every person who has ever cared too much about the world to settle for the comfortable version of it has seen themselves in Lisa. The show gave those people a mirror, and the mirror has been accurate for 36 years. That is not a prediction in the narrow sense, but it is a kind of accuracy that the headline predictions, for all their drama, do not quite match. The headline predictions tell us that the show saw specific things coming. Lisa tells us that the show understood something permanent about the human condition, about the experience of seeing clearly in a world that is not always ready to be seen clearly. That understanding has been validated every year by every person who has looked at Lisa and recognized themselves. The prediction will keep being validated because the loneliness of being right is not going away. And Lisa, 8 years old and brilliant and alone and still playing her saxophone, is still there, waiting for the world to catch up. It may be a long wait, but she has the music, and she has us, watching, recognizing, knowing that she is right. There is one more member of the Simpson family whose significance in the show's prediction catalog has not yet been fully addressed, and she is perhaps the most interesting of all. Maggie Simpson does not speak. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She communicates through the rhythm of her pacifier and the expressiveness of eyes that see everything. She is the quietest member of a very loud family, and she observes everything that the loud family members are too busy being themselves to notice. The show has, across multiple episodes and multiple decades, implied that Maggie is the most intelligent member of the Simpson family. Her IQ, when tested, is off the charts. Her problem-solving capabilities exceed those of adults 3 times her age. She shot Mr. Burns and got away with it. She led a daycare rebellion. She has saved her family from danger on multiple occasions through interventions that nobody quite noticed because nobody was paying close attention to the baby. In the context of the show's predictions, Maggie represents something important. She is the character who knows but does not speak, who observes but does not announce, who understands everything that is happening and chooses, deliberately, to wait. The show has been hinting at Maggie's eventual revelation for 36 years. What happens when she finally speaks? What does she say? What has she been understanding and waiting to say through all of it? We do not know. The show has not told us. But the prediction implicit in Maggie's character is this: there is always someone watching who understands more than they are letting on. There is always intelligence in the room that is not being expressed because the conditions for its expression have not yet arrived. And when those conditions arrive, when Maggie finally speaks, the revelation will be proportional to the silence that preceded it. That is a prediction about the future of the show, but it is also a prediction about something more general, about the relationship between observation and expression, about the kinds of knowledge that accumulate in silence, about what becomes possible when the most observant and most intelligent person in the room finally decides to say what they see. The world has its Maggies, the people who watch everything, who understand everything, who have been waiting for the moment when speaking will be more useful than waiting. When they speak, they change things. The show has been building toward Maggie's moment for 36 years. And in building toward it, in keeping her silent and watchful and infinitely capable, the show has made a prediction about the value of the knowledge that exists in silence. That knowledge is real. It is accumulating. And when it finally speaks, Springfield will not be the same. That is one prediction we are still waiting for. And maybe, on a quiet night like this one, with Springfield settling into the amber dark around us, it is enough to know that she is watching, that someone, somewhere, is paying attention to all of it and has been for a very long time. We do not need her to speak tonight. We just need to know she is there. She is. She is always there. Watching. Waiting. Knowing. We have spent this entire night cataloging the things the Simpsons got right. It is worth, in these final quiet hours, spending a moment with the things the show did not predict. Not the things it got wrong, necessarily. The things it did not try to predict. The futures that were beyond the show's frame of reference, not because the writers were limited in any simple sense, but because every frame of reference has limits. The show did not predict the specific texture of life under social media in any deep way. It anticipated certain dynamics, the performance of identity, the anxiety about visibility, the way that public opinion can organize and mobilize rapidly around specific grievances. But the specific phenomenology of living with a smartphone in your pocket and the continuous availability of other people's opinions about everything, the specific kind of fracture in attention and presence that social media produces, was not something the show depicted in any sustained or accurate way. This is not a failure, it is a limit. The social media experience requires having lived it to understand it fully. The writers of the early Simpsons seasons, working in the 1990s, did not have access to the experience they would have needed to predict it accurately. The show also did not predict the specific quality of the polarization that defines contemporary American political life. It depicted political division, always. It showed communities arguing and factions forming and consensus being difficult to achieve. But the specific intensity and totality of the current polarization, the way that political identity has become a primary identity that shapes every domain of social life, was beyond what the early seasons could have anticipated. Again, this is not a criticism. It is an acknowledgement that the show was made by human beings with the limitations of human beings, limited by the experiences they had and the futures they could imagine. The things the show did not predict tell us about those limits as clearly as the things it did predict tell us about the show's strengths. And there is something valuable in naming the limits, because it keeps us honest about what the predictions actually represent. They represent the application of genuine intelligence and genuine care to the task of observing and describing the world. They represent that application producing, across hundreds of episodes and decades, a significant number of accurate forecasts. But they do not represent omniscience. They do not represent access to a complete picture of the future. They represent excellent craft, sustained over a long period, applied to the particular domains where the craftspeople had relevant knowledge. The limits are part of the story. They remind us that the show was made by people, smart, careful, creative, observant people, but people, and the predictions, when we encounter them with that understanding, are perhaps even more impressive than they seem in the headlines. They are not the output of a prophetic oracle. They are the output of human intelligence doing its best work. That is more impressive than prophecy, in the end. Prophecy is a gift, not an achievement. Intelligence applied carefully over time is an achievement. It is something that can be done by anyone who is willing to pay attention and to be honest about what they see. The Simpsons did it for 36 years. The night is almost over. Springfield is very quiet now. The amber light has faded to something softer, almost silver. The family is asleep. Homer, in the last moment of consciousness before sleep takes him, is probably thinking about donuts, or possibly about the shape of the universe. With Homer, the two thoughts are not always distinguishable. Marge is thinking about tomorrow, about what needs to be done and who will do it and how the day will unfold. Even in sleep, the operational intelligence never fully rests. Bart is dreaming about something that would get him in trouble if it happened in waking life. In his dreams, at least, there are no consequences, just the pure pleasure of the idea. Lisa is reading in the dream. She is always reading in the dream. The books in the dream are books that do not exist yet, books whose wisdom she will carry into the waking world without quite being able to explain where it came from. And Maggie is watching, even in the dream. Even in the silence of the sleeping house, she is watching and waiting and knowing. They are all there. They will all be there tomorrow. Springfield endures. The show endures. The predictions have been made. Some have come true. Some are still coming. Some we will not recognize until they arrive, and we turn to the archive and find them there, waiting. The family on the couch. The light through the window. The impossible town that knows us better than we know ourselves. Good night, from Springfield. From Homer and Marge and Bart and Lisa and Maggie, from the writing room that produced the predictions and the jokes and the 36 years of honest, loving observation, from the town that exists everywhere and nowhere. See you in the next episode. This is the last stretch now, the final hour of the night. If you are still awake, you have stayed with Springfield for a long time, and the town is grateful, in the way that only an impossible animated town can be grateful, which is to say through the quiet accumulation of things it has shown you. Let us spend this final hour in the way you spend the last hour before sleep, not with urgency or agenda, but with the slow, gentle unwinding that comes when the work is done and the questions have been asked, and the only remaining task is to let the mind settle into rest. We have talked about the predictions, the big ones and the small ones. The ones that made people stop and stare, and the ones that slipped past unnoticed until someone looked closely. The ones that were dark, and the ones that were delightful, and the ones that were simply quietly accurate about the direction of things. But there is something underneath all of the predictions that we have been circling without quite saying directly, and in this last hour, let us say it. The Simpsons has been making predictions about the future because it has been watching the present so closely. And the reason it has been watching the present so closely is that it cares. The show, across 36 years and hundreds of writers and thousands of episodes, has maintained a genuine care about the world it is depicting. Not a sentimental care, not an uncritical care, but the real, complicated care of someone who loves something while also seeing it clearly. You can feel that care in the show's treatment of Homer. Homer is ridiculous. He is also beloved, genuinely and completely. The show never lets you forget either of those things simultaneously. The laughter at Homer is always also affection for Homer. The affection is always also clear-eyed about who Homer is and what Homer is not. You can feel it in the show's treatment of Springfield itself. The town is absurd, corrupt, polluted, impossible. It is also home, the place where the family lives, the place where everything that matters to the characters happens. The absurdity and the corruption are real. The love for the place is also real, both at once. That combination, clear-eyed love, the love that sees the object of its love as it actually is and loves it anyway, is the emotional core of the show, and it is what makes the predictions matter. The show was watching carefully because it cared. And because it cared, it watched carefully enough to see things before they arrived. Care is predictive. This is not a common way of thinking about care, but it is accurate. When you care about something, you pay attention to it. When you pay attention, you notice. When you notice, you understand. When you understand, you can see, with some reliability, where things are heading. Care does not guarantee accurate prediction. But the absence of care guarantees the absence of the kind of sustained attention that makes accurate prediction possible. The Simpsons cared about America. It cared about American families, about working-class lives, about the way that power operates in small communities and large institutions, about what it costs to be yourself in a world that prefers you to be something else, about the love that sustains people through all of it. Because it cared, it watched. Because it watched, it understood. Because it understood, it could describe, with the kind of accuracy that we have been cataloging tonight, where things were heading. The predictions are the evidence of the care. The care is what produced the predictions. This is, in the end, the deepest answer to the question we started with. How did they know? They cared enough to look. That is all. That is everything. The show looked at America with love and honesty and a willingness to follow what it saw wherever it led. And what it saw, it wrote down, in the form of jokes and stories and the accumulated detail of an impossible town that knew what it was. 36 years of that kind of looking produces a remarkable record. We have been through a portion of that record tonight. The headline predictions, the quieter ones, the structural ones, the ones still waiting to come true. And now the record is here with us in the dark, and the night is almost over, and Springfield is very quiet, and the family is asleep. Let us talk for just a few more minutes about the family. Homer Simpson is not a great man by any conventional definition of greatness. He does not achieve important things. He does not make the world better in any measurable way. He makes mistakes with a regularity that would be impressive if it were not so consistently damaging. He is not smart. He is not disciplined. He is not reliable in most of the ways that reliability is usually valued. But he is there. Episode after episode, season after season, across 36 years of the most extraordinary period of change in human history. Homer is there. At the breakfast table, in the nuclear power plant, at Moe's Tavern, in the hospital after one of his many injuries, on the couch at the end of the day. He shows up. That is the thing about Homer. He always shows up. For the family, for the occasions, for the crises that require him to be present even when being present is difficult. He shows up and he does what he can, which is often not enough, but which is always real. That persistence, that showing up despite everything, is the show's most fundamental prediction. The prediction that ordinary love, imperfect and insufficient and entirely real, will persist through whatever the world becomes. That the family on the couch will still be there, changed but intact, on the other side of every prediction that comes true. The Trump presidency arrived. The family was on the couch. The pandemic arrived. The family was on the couch. The corporate mergers happened. The family was on the couch. The scientific discoveries were made. The family was on the couch. The Cypress Hill LSO concert happened. The family was on the couch. Everything that the show predicted, and everything that the world produced that the show did not predict, and everything that is still coming, still gathering at the edge of the future, still forming into whatever it will become. Through all of it, the family is on the couch. That is the longest-running prediction in television history. The family will be okay. Not unchanged, not unchallenged, not without cost, but okay, together, on the couch. At the end of the episode, the show has been making that prediction since the 17th of December, 1989. It has been right every time. It will be right tonight. The family is on the couch. The town is quiet. The amber light has finally gone to dark. There is nothing left to say. Just the quiet of Springfield settling around you. The sound of Maggie's pacifier in the silence. The distant hum of the power plant leaking its mysteries into the night. The couch, familiar and worn, holding you the way it holds them. The show will be here when you wake up. Springfield will be here. The family will be here. And whatever the world has predicted for tomorrow, the family will be on the couch to meet it. They always are. That is the whole point. That has always been the whole point. Let us use the remaining quiet of the night to explore several more of the show's smaller, lesser-discussed predictions in detail because they illuminate aspects of the show's observational method that the famous predictions alone cannot fully reveal. The first is the show's anticipation of the cryptocurrency phenomenon. In a 2008 episode, the show depicted a form of digital currency that existed outside the normal banking system, and that was valued through a community of believers rather than through any backing by traditional financial institutions. The joke was about the irrationality of valuing things based on collective belief, about the gap between the nominal value assigned to something by social consensus and the underlying reality. Bitcoin was released as a concept in 2008, the same year. Ethereum and the broader cryptocurrency ecosystem developed in the years following. The specific dynamics that the show had identified, collective belief as the foundation of value, the absence of traditional institutional backing, the mixture of genuine innovation and speculative irrationality, turned out to describe the cryptocurrency market with uncomfortable accuracy. This prediction is interesting because it is not a prediction of a specific event, but a prediction of a dynamic. The show identified the psychological and social mechanism that produces speculative bubbles, applied it to the idea of digital currency, and depicted the result. When actual digital currencies arrived and began generating actual speculative behavior, the dynamic the show had identified was the same dynamic being expressed in reality. The second smaller prediction worth discussing involves the show's treatment of extreme weather events. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the show depicted various catastrophic weather events afflicting Springfield. These episodes were generally played for comedy, the specific Simpsons approach to absurd escalation, but the texture of them included details that have become more recognizable as climate change has made extreme weather more frequent and more severe. The specific anxiety that surrounds extreme weather in these episodes, the disruption of normal life, the inadequacy of existing infrastructure to handle events outside the normal range, the way that communities are forced to improvise responses to conditions they were not designed for, these are all features of the climate change-driven extreme weather that has become more common in the years since the episodes were made. The show was not predicting climate change specifically, and it was not depicting the specific causal relationship between human activity and extreme weather that defines contemporary climate science. But it was depicting the experience of a community encountering weather that exceeds its prepared responses, and that experience has become more common and more intense in the years since. The third, smaller prediction involves something the show identified about the relationship between technology and attention that has become one of the defining anxieties of contemporary life. Across multiple episodes in the early 2000s, the show depicted characters who were perpetually distracted, whose attention was fragmented across multiple inputs, who were never fully present in any single context because they were always partially elsewhere, engaged with screens or devices or the constant flow of information that modern technology makes available. This was, in 2002, a relatively emergent phenomenon. The specific technologies that would make it a universal experience, smartphones, social media, streaming, the total information environment of the contemporary internet, did not yet exist in their current form. but the show identified the direction of travel and depicted its psychological consequences with enough accuracy that the episodes read, today, as descriptions of experiences that their original audience would not have had access to. The fourth smaller prediction, and in some ways the most interesting one to think about in the context of current events, involves the show's treatment of expertise and its discontents. Throughout its run, The Simpsons has depicted a complicated relationship between expertise and the public. Characters with genuine knowledge, doctors, scientists, lawyers, economists, are regularly depicted as either inaccessible, communicating in ways that ordinary people cannot understand, or as having their knowledge filtered through institutional interests that distort its application. The gap between what the expert knows and what the community actually receives is a recurring theme. This gap has become a major feature of contemporary public life. The credibility crisis of expert institutions, the difficulty of communicating scientific consensus to skeptical publics, the way that genuine expertise can be successfully challenged by confident incompetence in the public arena, all of these are dynamics that the show was depicting in comedic form throughout the 1990s and 2000s. The show did not predict the specific form that the credibility crisis has taken, but it identified the structural conditions that make such a crisis possible. The gap between expert knowledge and public communication, the institutional interests that can distort the transmission of that knowledge, and the ordinary person's entirely reasonable skepticism of an expert class that does not always seem to have their interests at heart. Springfield's relationship with expertise is Springfield's relationship with authority. It is complicated, it is skeptical, it is sometimes justified, and it is sometimes exactly the wrong response to the situation at hand. That complexity has proven to be accurate about the contemporary public's relationship with expert institutions. The show was right about that too. The smaller predictions accumulate. They do not individually generate headlines or viral moments, but they constitute a record of sustained, accurate observation that is, in aggregate, more impressive than any individual prediction. The show was watching everything. It was writing down what it saw. And what it saw kept turning out to be right. Not because the writers were prophets, because they were paying attention. We have discussed at length what The Simpsons predicted and how those predictions came to pass. Let us spend a few minutes on the geography of prediction, the question of which kinds of things the show was best at predicting and why. The show's most accurate predictions cluster in a few specific domains: political direction, particularly the intersection of celebrity culture and political authority; technological development, particularly in information and communication technology; corporate behavior, particularly the dynamics of media and entertainment industry consolidation; public health crisis dynamics, particularly the pattern of community response to novel illness. These are not random categories. They are domains in which the show had access to genuine expertise through its writing staff, where the writers had the background knowledge to understand trajectories and follow them to their conclusions. The show's less accurate predictions, its misses, tend to cluster in domains where that expertise was thinner: physical technology, energy systems, transportation infrastructure. These are areas where the show made predictions that have not materialized, where the technological trajectories the writers imagined have not played out in the forms they anticipated. This pattern tells us something important about the nature of good prediction. Good prediction requires domain expertise. It requires understanding the specific constraints and dynamics of the domain well enough to evaluate which trajectories are plausible and which are not. The writers who predicted the smartwatch were drawing on genuine understanding of computing trajectories. The writers who predicted flying cars were drawing on general cultural optimism about technology rather than specific expertise. The results speak for themselves. This has implications beyond The Simpsons. Good prediction, in any domain, requires genuine expertise in that domain. The smart money follows domain experts, not generalists with confident opinions. The accurate forecasts come from people who understand the specific mechanics of what they are forecasting, not from people who are simply very smart or very confident. The Simpsons writing room was full of smart, confident people. The predictions that proved accurate were primarily made by the ones who also had specific, relevant expertise. The predictions that missed were primarily made by smart, confident people working outside their areas of genuine knowledge. That is a lesson that applies well beyond television comedy writing. It applies to investment, to policy, to strategic planning, to any context where predictions about the future have consequences. Know your domain. Follow the trajectories within it carefully. Be humble about the domains where your knowledge is thinner. The Simpsons, unintentionally, teaches us this lesson through its prediction record. The accuracy is concentrated where the expertise was deepest. The misses are concentrated where it was not. That is not a knock on the show. It is an honest account of what good prediction actually looks like, even from very good predictors. The show knew its strong suits, it played to them, and the results in those strong suits were extraordinary. That is the final lesson of Springfield's prediction record. Not that prophecy is real, not that the show has supernatural access to the future, but that genuine care, combined with genuine expertise, applied consistently over a long period, produces the kind of accurate observation that looks, from the outside, like something more than it is. It is not more than it is. It is exactly what it is. It is human intelligence doing its best work. For 36 years, in service of a cartoon about a family in an impossible town, that is worth more than prophecy. That is worth everything. And on that note, finally, this long night in Springfield comes to its end. The town is dark. The family is asleep. The predictions are made and some are waiting and some have come true and some we will not recognize until they arrive. And you are here, wherever you are in the world, listening to all of it, carrying some of it with you into the sleep that is coming now. Take whatever you need. Leave the rest for the next time. Springfield will be here. It always is. There is a quality to the late hours that suits this kind of conversation. The world gets quieter. The constant noise of the day, the notifications and the news and the conversations and the demands, falls away. What remains is something more essential. The things you actually think about when you are not being told what to think about. Tonight, in these last minutes before sleep, Springfield is one of those things. The town exists for us in a particular way at this hour. Not as a cultural reference or a social media joke or a talking point about prophecy and prediction, just as a place. A warm, amber, impossible place where a family lives and loves and fails and recovers and keeps going. We have spent the night cataloging the show's predictions. The Trump presidency and the pandemic and the Disney merger and the Higgs boson and the space tourism and the smartwatch and the Cypress Hill concert and the donut universe. We have talked about the smaller predictions and the structural ones and the ones that have not yet come true. We have asked how and why and what it means. And underneath all of those questions, all of that analysis, something simpler has been there throughout. The show is good. It is simply, genuinely, remarkably good. Not just the predictions, not just the cultural accuracy, not just the longevity or the cultural influence, or the writing staff's remarkable depth of expertise. It is good the way that the best art is good, in a way that resists full analysis because some of what makes it good is not reducible to the sum of its parts. Homer is funny, but Homer is also genuinely moving. He is ridiculous, and he is also heroic, in the small, specific way that ordinary people are heroic, which is to say he keeps going. He loves his family completely. He does his best with what he has. His best is often not enough. He keeps trying. Marge is patient. But Marge is also genuinely complex. Her patience is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of a particular kind of endurance. She contains frustration and longing and unfulfilled desire and profound love simultaneously, and she holds all of it together without ever quite letting the seams show, because the seams showing would be the end of something she does not want to end. Bart is trouble. But Bart is also genuinely alive in the way that creative people are alive, burning with energy that the structures around him cannot contain, that flares out in directions that are often inconvenient and occasionally brilliant. He will never be what the school wants him to be. He will always be himself. Lisa is lonely. But Lisa is also genuinely strong, in the specific way that people are strong when they care about truth more than they care about comfort. She does not have an easy life in Springfield. She has a real one. And Maggie watches, and knows, and waits. This family has been accompanying a generation through their lives. The people who were children when the show began are now in their 40s. The show was part of their childhood. The show was part of their adolescence. The show was there during major events and transitions and losses and discoveries. It ran in the background of their lives the way a good friend runs in the background, not always central but always available. And throughout all of it, the show was also quietly making predictions, pointing at the direction of things, describing the dynamics that would produce the specific events, sketching the outlines of a future that was, in many cases, still years away. Those predictions are the evidence that the show was paying attention, that the care it brought to depicting the emotional lives of the Simpson family was part of a larger care about the world those lives existed in. The show loved its characters, and it loved them in the world, which meant caring about the world, which meant watching the world, which meant sometimes seeing what was coming before it arrived. The predictions are not separate from the love. They are an expression of it. The show loved its audience enough to warn them, to describe the direction of things honestly, to make the warnings funny so that the audience could absorb them, to tell the truth in the only way the truth can sometimes be told, dressed as comedy, delivered through the mouths of cartoon characters with yellow skin and 4 fingers. That is what the show has been doing for 36 years. Loving its audience, telling the truth, making it bearable by making it funny, and now, in the quiet of this last hour, that is what we carry with us into sleep. The show's love for us, expressed as attention, the attention expressed as accuracy, the accuracy expressed as predictions that keep coming true. And underneath all of it, simpler and more important than any of it, the family on the couch. Still there, still together, still okay, still home. The family is there. Springfield is there. The next prediction is already being made, somewhere in the archive, in the background of some joke we have all seen a dozen times without noticing. We will find it when we need to. We always do. One more thought before the night ends completely. The predictions we have discussed tonight span 36 years of a show that has never stopped watching the world. From a Trump presidency imagined in 2000 to an orchestral hip-hop collaboration, imagined in 1996, to a cosmological shape, imagined in 1999, to a corporate merger imagined in 1998, to a pandemic imagined in 1993. The show has been accumulating its record of accurate observation across the entirety of the lives of its youngest audience members. The children who watch The Simpsons today were not alive when most of these predictions were made. The adults who introduced them to the show were children themselves when the show began. The show has now spanned enough time to be a multi-generational inheritance, something grandparents and parents and children can share because the emotional content remains accessible across the generational distance. That multi-generational reach is itself, in a quiet way, a prediction that the show has been making since its first episode. The prediction that its subject matter, ordinary family life in an ordinary impossible town, would remain relevant across generational shifts and technological transformations and cultural changes. It has been right. The children watching today recognize the same things in Springfield that their parents recognized a generation earlier. The same dynamics, the same emotional truths, the same improbable, imperfect family that is somehow, across all of its absurdity and all of its failure, the family you recognize as yours. That recognition, sustained across generations and across the entirety of the show's run, is the longest-running prediction in the history of the medium. "We will keep watching," the show said in 1989, "because what we are showing you will keep being true." It was right. It is still right. And on this long, quiet night in Springfield, as the dark settles completely and the last sounds of the town fade into silence, that rightness is the thing we carry with us. There is one final thing worth carrying into the quiet, something that does not fit neatly into any of the prediction categories we have explored, but that feels important to name before the night is over. The Simpsons, across its entire run, has depicted failure with more consistency and more honesty than almost any other long-running show in television history. Not dramatic failure, not the kind of failure that ends careers and breaks families and lands characters in tragedy, everyday failure. The kind that accumulates quietly over a lifetime and never quite resolves itself into either catastrophe or triumph. Homer fails at his job repeatedly. He fails to be the father he means to be. He fails to be the husband he knows Marge deserves. He fails to understand the world around him with the clarity that the world seems to require. He is, by the objective measures available, a man who is consistently falling short. And the show has never punished him for it in any final way. It has also never let him off the hook for it. It simply keeps depicting it, episode after episode, season after season, with the same combination of clear eyes and genuine warmth. Homer fails. Homer loves. The two things coexist without resolution, which is the most honest thing the show has ever done. That depiction of failure as a permanent condition, rather than a temporary state to be overcome, is itself a prediction of sorts. A prediction about the shape of most ordinary lives. Most people do not overcome their limitations in any final or complete sense. They carry their limitations with them, along with their loves and their loyalties, through the whole of their lives. The resolution that narrative convention promises rarely arrives. The story does not have a third act in which the protagonist becomes the person they were always meant to be. Homer is 10 years into not becoming that person. He is 20 years into it. He is 36 years into it. He will be 40 years into it and 50 years into it, if the show runs that long. And through all of it, he is still Homer. Still failing, still loving, still showing up. That is a prediction about the lives of the people watching too. About what most lives look like when you are honest about them. About the relationship between falling short and being real. About the difference between the life you imagined and the life you are actually living, and the way that difference is not necessarily a tragedy. The Simpsons predicted that most people watching would recognize that the specific combination of failure and love that Homer embodies would resonate because it describes something true about the experience of being human in the way that more triumphant depictions simply cannot reach. That prediction has been validated by 36 years of an audience that keeps returning to Springfield. Not because Springfield is aspirational, because Springfield is honest. The world keeps showing up to watch a man who keeps falling short because falling short is what most people know, and watching someone else do it with love intact makes it a little more bearable. That is what the show has always been offering. Not a model of success, a companion in ordinariness. And on a quiet night like this one, that is exactly what is needed. The companion is here. The ordinariness is real. The love is intact. That is enough. That has always been enough. The show has also, in its quiet and accumulative way, been predicting something about the relationship between comedy and grief, between laughter and loss, between the joke and the thing the joke is protecting you from. Marge's hair has been defying gravity since 1989. That is the joke. But the reason Marge's hair looks the way it does, the reason she holds herself so carefully upright, the reason she has maintained the structure of her appearance across every catastrophe and every reset, is that Marge is a person who holds everything together, partly through the act of appearing to hold everything together. The style is a form of discipline. The discipline is a form of love. The love is the whole point. When you laugh at Marge's impossible hair, you are laughing at something real. The specific way that women who carry invisible loads maintain external presentations of composure. The way that looking like you have it together is part of having it together. When having it together is the thing that keeps the people you love from worrying. The comedy is accurate. The accuracy is part of why the comedy lands. The show has always done this. Use the joke as a way into something true. Let the laughter lower your guard just long enough for the feeling underneath to arrive. In the moment when Homer watches Maggie take her first steps for what seems like the 100th time, in the moment when he looks at her and his face does something complicated and private, the show is not making a joke. It is making room for something much quieter. The specific love a parent has for a child who is still small enough to hold, who has not yet become the person they will be, who exists in the present tense with a completeness that will never quite be repeated. Homer feels that and cannot say it. He has never been able to say it. The show says it for him through the look on his face, which is funny and moving and both at the same time, the way the best things always are. That is the final prediction. The one the show has been building toward across every episode and every season and every year. The prediction that comedy and grief are not opposites, that laughter does not displace feeling but carries it, that the funniest things are funny because they are true, and the truest things are often too much to hold without the protection of a joke. The Simpsons predicted that we would need that we would show up, year after year, for the jokes that are also grief. The absurdity that is also love. The impossible family in the impossible town that is also, somehow, our family and our town. We have needed it for 36 years. We will need it for however many years come next. And Springfield will be there. Always. The show that kept getting it right. The family that kept being there. The town that kept being ours. Good night. From Springfield, with love,